Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating whether to post this for weeks now. I'm not one for making up stories or jumping to conclusions. I've spent most of my life hunting and tracking in the Florida swamps, and I know the difference between normal wildlife behavior and something different. What happened to me 3 weeks ago at Dutchman's Creek still keeps me up at night, and I can't make sense of it. I decided to do a solo hike at Dutchman's Creek in Uwharrie National Forest. It was a Tuesday morning, and I figured the trails would be pretty empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I needed some alone time to clear my head after a stressful month at work. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 in the morning. The parking lot was completely empty except for my truck. I remember checking my phone before heading out. No reception, which didn't surprise me out there. The morning was unusually quiet. Normally in forests like this, you hear birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, but that day there was this heavy stillness that I noticed right away. I chalked it up to the overcast weather and pushed on. The only sounds for the first mile or so were occasional logging trucks passing on the distant service road. About 2 miles in, I rounded this bend in the trail, a spot where the path curves around a thick stand of old pines. That's when I heard it, a sharp, deliberate wood knock coming from my right side, maybe 50 yards into the trees. Not a woodpecker. I know that sound well. This was a single, heavy knock, like someone had taken a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Before I could even process it, another knock answered from my left, maybe the same distance away. The response was immediate, like they were communicating. My first thought was hikers playing around, but I hadn't seen a single car at the trailhead. I stood completely still, listening. The forest had gone dead silent. No birds, no nothing, just me and whatever had made those sounds. I'm not ashamed to admit my heart was pounding. I've been in the wilderness my whole life, and I've never felt watched like I did in that moment. I pulled out my water bottle just for something to do while I waited and listened for about 30 minutes. Nothing else happened, so I convinced myself it was probably just branches falling or some logical explanation. I continued hiking, trying to shake off the weird feeling. The trail looped around, and about an hour later, I found myself approaching the same bend from the opposite direction. I slowed down, feeling tense without really knowing why. As I reached the bend again, it happened a second time, a knock from my left, then within a literal second, an answering knock from behind me to the right. Same pattern, different positions. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate to be coincidence. I froze. These weren't random falling branches. Whatever was making these sounds was keeping track of me, following my movement on the trail. The knocks were positioned differently based on my direction of travel, which meant whatever made them was aware of me. I stood there for several minutes, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to head straight back to my truck, but curiosity got the better of me. I'd been tracking animals for decades. This was an opportunity to maybe figure out what was going on. I noticed an old ATV trail leading off toward where I'd heard the second knock. It was overgrown, but still passable. I decided to follow it, moving slowly and quietly. The forest seemed to press in around me as I left the main trail. The air felt heavy and still, like before a thunderstorm. About 200 yards down the ATV trail, I heard another wood knock, coming from the same area as before. This one was louder, more forceful. I stopped immediately and just stood there, barely breathing for about 15 minutes. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The silence was becoming more unnerving than the knocks. In a healthy forest, there's always background noise. Bird calls, wind in the trees, small animals moving through undergrowth. But here, it was like everything was holding its breath. I decided I'd pushed my luck far enough and turned to head back to the main trail. That's when I heard it. a soft, deliberate huffing sound directed right at me from a deep ditch just over my left shoulder. It wasn't a deer snort or a bear's heavy breathing. It was controlled, almost like someone trying to get my attention without speaking. I whipped around, scanning the ditch and the thick vegetation beyond it. Nothing moved, not a single branch or leaf. Whatever made that sound was completely still, watching me. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I've never experienced before. The huffing had come from less than 10 feet away, but I couldn't see anything there. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot. The huffing didn't repeat, but the silence felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. I made my way back to the main trail as calmly as I could, fighting the urge to run. When I reached the trailhead, I sat in my truck for about 20 minutes trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my brain was searching for explanations. Other hikers playing pranks, unusual bird calls, wind patterns, but nothing fit. I've spent enough time tracking wildlife to know this wasn't normal animal behavior. Instead of leaving, I made a decision that, looking back, was probably stupid. I decided to go back. This time, I would be more careful, move quietly, stay alert. I wanted to know what was out there. I checked my pistol in its holster, I always carry when hiking alone, took a deep breath, and headed back down the trail. I moved as silently as possible, placing each foot carefully to avoid crunching leaves or snapping twigs. When I got near the bend where I'd heard the knocks, I left the main trail and took a roundabout approach through the trees, trying to come at the area from a different angle. I'd been in the woods for maybe 15 minutes when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low moaning sound came from the thick brush across the ditch where I'd heard the huffing earlier. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't like any animal I knew either. Almost like a strange baby's cry, but more guttural, more animalistic. It rose and fell in pitch, lasting about 10 seconds before fading away. I crouched down, completely still, listening intently. About 3 minutes later, it came again. The same moaning cry, but from a slightly different direction, maybe 20 yards from the first one. Then, another few minutes passed, and I heard it again, from yet another position. Whatever was making this sound was moving through the brush without making any noise except for the moaning. The vegetation was thick. Walls of brambles, young saplings and fallen trees created a nearly impenetrable barrier. I couldn't see more than a few feet into it, but the sound seemed to be coming from just beyond my line of sight, always just out of view. I stayed there for nearly an hour as the strange crying sound continued to circle my position. It would stop for 5 or 10 minutes, then start again from a new location. Not once did I see any movement in the vegetation, not a single branch moving or leaf rustling. Whatever was in there was big enough to make that deep, resonant sound, but moved like a ghost. I thought about pushing into the brush to investigate. I had my gun, after all, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Some primitive instinct warning me not to follow. The way this thing moved silently through dense undergrowth that would have had me crashing and cursing, it wasn't natural. The final straw came when the moaning suddenly stopped, and in its place came 3 quick wood knocks from directly behind me, back toward the trail I'd come from. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing there, just trees and silence. Whatever this was, it had somehow circled behind me without making a sound. That's when I decided I was done. I backed away slowly, then turned and made my way back to the trailhead as quickly as I could without running. I felt watched the entire way, like eyes were tracking my every move through the trees. I've been back to that forest hundreds of times over the years. I've encountered bears, boars, coyotes, and all manner of wildlife. I know what animals sound like when they move through the brush. I know their calls, their habits. This wasn't that. The wood knocks were deliberate communication. The huffing was directed at me specifically. And that moaning cry, I've replayed it in my head every night since, and I still can't match it to any known animal. The most unsettling part was how it could move through thick vegetation without disturbing a single leaf or branch. I've tried researching similar experiences online. Some people have suggested I encountered a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I've always been skeptical of those stories. Yet I can't explain what happened that day. The coordinated knocks, the huffing, the moaning cries that seemed to be trying to draw me deeper into the brush. It all points to something intelligent, something that was aware of me and responding to my presence. I haven't gone back to Dutchman's Creek since then. I'm not sure I ever will, at least not alone. Whatever was in those woods that day was watching me, tracking me, maybe even trying to communicate with me. And the fact that I never saw it, despite how close it must have been, makes me wonder if it didn't want to be seen. I still don't know what to make of it all, but I know what I heard, and I know it wasn't normal. Some things in the forest don't fit into neat explanations, and I think I encountered one of them. Story 2. I've never told this story to many people, and I'm still not sure I should be sharing it now. What happened to me on Y Mountain in '82 has stayed with me for all these years. I can still feel the cold sweat running down my back when I think about it. I was 26 then, an avid hunter who thought I knew those mountains like the back of my hand. I'd been hunting in Utah County since I was a teenager, tagging along with my dad and uncles. By '82, I was confident enough to head out alone, even for overnight trips. Looking back now, I realize how cocky I was. It was Halloween, October 31st, 1982. Most guys my age were probably gearing up for parties, but I'd planned this trip for weeks. The weather had been perfect, cold enough for tracking but not bitter. There'd been snowfall a couple days before, about a foot deep on the mountain, which I figured would make tracking deer easier. I packed light, my Winchester, some jerky, a small tent, sleeping bag, and a thermos of coffee. I told my girlfriend I'd be back the next day. She thought I was crazy for going up there on Halloween, but I just laughed it off. I started the hike up Y Mountain around noon. The snow made the climb tougher than usual, but I was in good shape back then. The sun was bright, glinting off the snow in that way that makes you squint even behind sunglasses. Everything seemed normal, just me, the mountain, and the quiet. That kind of quiet you only get when snow dampens every sound. I reached the summit around 4 in the afternoon. The plan was to set up camp, maybe bag a deer if I spotted one, then head back down the next morning. Simple enough. But as soon as I got to the clearing near the top, something felt off. There were footprints in the snow. Now, finding tracks on a mountain isn't unusual. Hikers, other hunters, wildlife, but these were different. They came from the north side of the mountain, crossed the summit area, and headed toward the valley overlook to the west. What caught my attention was how deep they were in the foot-deep snow. Whatever made them was heavy. At first, I figured maybe it was another hunter. I decided to follow the tracks to the overlook, thinking I might find someone there. The snow was tiring to trudge through, so I started stepping in the existing footprints to make it easier. That's when I really noticed it. My boots barely filled half of each impression. I paused, crouching down to look closer. My first thought was maybe someone was wearing snowshoes, but these weren't the right shape. They were elongated, yes, but they narrowed at what would be the heel. As I followed them further, the tracks passed under the shadow of a big evergreen where the snow was thinner. That's when my blood went cold. These weren't boot prints. They were barefoot, human-like, with 5 distinct toe impressions at the front of each track. But they were enormous. I wear a size 11 boot, and these tracks made mine look like a child's. I pulled off my glove and placed my hand next to one of the clearer impressions. The print was easily twice the width of my palm. I lined up my boot next to another track and estimated it had to be at least 15 inches long. 15 inches. That's not human. Not even close. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees around me. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the snow. Suddenly, the mountain didn't feel so familiar anymore. I'd been hunting these areas for years, but I'd never seen anything like this. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was playing a prank, walking around with fake feet. But out here, miles from the nearest road, and the depth of the impression suggested whatever made them was heavy, much heavier than a person. The smart move would have been to turn around right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I kept following the tracks to the valley overlook, my rifle now held ready instead of slung over my shoulder. The overlook was empty, just a stunning view of Utah Valley below, the settlements looking tiny from up there. The tracks continued along the ridge for about 50 yards before turning and heading down toward Rock Canyon. Standing there, with the wind picking up and the temperature dropping as the sun began to set, I made a decision that still haunts me. I wasn't staying overnight anymore. Whatever made those tracks was still out there, and I didn't want to meet it in the dark. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, enough time to get down if I moved quickly. I started descending, choosing to follow a different path than the strange tracks. My plan was to cut across to the main trail and get down to my truck as fast as possible. The snow made the going slow, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees around me. About halfway down, where the trail curves around a rocky outcropping, I froze. There they were again, the same massive barefoot prints, but these were fresher. They crossed my path, coming from the east and heading down into Rock Canyon. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. These tracks hadn't been here when I came up. Whatever made them had passed this way while I was at the summit. Against my better judgment, I followed them, keeping about 20 feet back, as if the thing might suddenly appear. The tracks led down into a small clearing where something had happened that I still can't explain. In the center of the clearing stood a small pine tree, or what was left of one. It had been snapped off about 2 feet from the ground, not cut, not chewed by an animal, snapped clean, with the top part tossed aside. Around this broken tree, the tracks circled repeatedly, packing down the snow in a perfect ring about 8 feet in diameter. The strangest part was that the tracks never entered the circle. Whatever it was had reached in from the perimeter to snap the tree, carefully keeping to the outside of the ring it had created. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. After circling the tree multiple times, the tracks continued down the canyon in a different direction. I stood there staring at this scene, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't animal behavior. Bears don't make circles around trees they damage. Mountain lions don't walk on 2 feet, leaving human-like prints. And no human I've ever known walks barefoot in foot-deep snow, stands over 7 feet tall based on the stride length, or performs strange rituals with trees in remote mountain clearings. The sun was getting dangerously low now, casting an orange glow through the trees. I needed to get off this mountain before dark. I turned and started hiking as fast as I could toward the main trail, no longer caring about being quiet. Every snap of a twig behind me made me whip around, rifle ready. Every shadow looked like a massive figure standing just out of clear view. About a mile from the trailhead, I heard it, a sound I've never been able to forget. It wasn't quite a howl, and it wasn't quite a scream. It was something in between, echoing through the canyon with a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before, not wolf, not elk, not human, just other. I ran the rest of the way down that mountain, slipping and sliding in the snow, barely keeping my footing. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost completely dark. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, just a shadow at the edge of the trees where the trailhead began. It could have been anything, a deer, shadows playing tricks, my imagination in overdrive, but I know what I think it was. Something tall, standing upright, watching me leave. I never went hunting alone after that day. I've told a few hunting buddies over the years, usually after a few beers, but most just laugh it off as a Halloween scare. I've researched what it might have been, read books on Bigfoot sightings, Native American legends about wild men in the mountains, even looked into reports of strange encounters in Utah County. There have been others who've seen similar things in those mountains, though not many talk about it openly. I still don't know what to make of those tracks or that broken tree. What kind of creature walks on 2 feet, has toes like a human but twice the size, and performs what looks like rituals with trees? And why was it on Y Mountain that Halloween day? All I know is what I saw. 15-inch barefoot tracks in the snow, a deliberately broken tree, and a perfect circle that something massive had carefully created but never stepped inside. I've never gone back to that specific part of the mountain. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. Sometimes when it snows and I'm alone at night, I still hear that sound, that not quite howl, not quite scream, echoing in my memory. And I wonder if it's still out there, walking those mountains, leaving its massive tracks for some other unsuspecting hunter to find. Story 3. I've been a police officer out here in Broken Bow for over 5 years now. Never once had to draw my weapon on duty, not during domestics, not during the occasional bar fight, not even when we caught those guys cooking meth last summer. I've always been able to de-escalate, to talk things down. That changed last Tuesday. I got a call about strange activity on this massive property west of town. About 2,000 acres of dense forest that some rich guy from Oklahoma City bought years ago but barely visits. Locals had been reporting weird noises, and someone said they saw lights deep in the woods where there shouldn't be any. My sergeant figured it was probably kids partying or maybe someone setting up to grow weed, so he sent me to check it out. It was about 4 in the afternoon when I got there. The weather was decent, cloudy but not raining, around 60 degrees. I parked my cruiser at the edge of the property where this old dirt road ends. There's a gate there, but it was unlocked. I radioed in my location and that I was proceeding on foot. The path leading in was barely visible, overgrown and rough. The forest out there is thick pine and brush, the kind where you can't see more than 20 feet ahead in any direction. The whole place had this weird quietness to it, like the usual forest sounds were muted or something. I remember thinking it was strange, there weren't any birds calling. I've hunted these woods my whole life, so I'm not someone who gets spooked easily in the forest, but something felt off from the moment I stepped onto that path. It's hard to explain, like that feeling when you walk into your house and somehow know someone's been there while you were gone. About 20 minutes in, I started hearing something. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe a black bear. We get those around here sometimes, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing parallel to me, staying just out of sight in the thick brush to my left. I stopped and called out, "Police officer, identify yourself!" My voice sounded small in that big forest. The footsteps stopped immediately. Then I heard this deep grunt that didn't sound like any animal I know. It wasn't a bear or a hog. It was deeper, more, I don't know, controlled. Then came this sound I'll never forget. Something slammed against a tree so hard the impact echoed through the forest. Wham! Like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk, but 10 times louder. I felt it in my chest. My hand went to my holster instinctively. I called out again, "This is Officer Jennings with Broken Bow PD. Come out where I can see you." Nothing. Complete silence. I stood perfectly still, listening. That's when I heard movement behind me. Whatever it was had somehow circled around without making a sound until it was ready to be heard. Another slam came from behind me. Wham! And then this growl. Jesus, I don't even know how to describe it. It was so deep and powerful that I physically felt it vibrate in my chest. It wasn't like a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else entirely. I turned around slowly, unholstering my weapon for the first time in my career outside the firing range. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I am armed," I announced, trying to keep my voice level. "Identify yourself now, or I will consider you a threat." Nothing visible, just the dense forest and lengthening shadows as the afternoon wore on, but I could feel something watching me. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. I made the decision to back out. Whatever this was, I wasn't equipped to handle it alone. I started moving back toward my vehicle, keeping my gun at the ready position, scanning the woods constantly. As I walked, I radioed in that I was heading back to my vehicle and would need backup to continue the investigation. My sergeant asked if I was in danger, and I honestly didn't know how to answer that. I just said I'd encountered something unusual and would explain when I got back. I was maybe 5 minutes from my truck when the first rock hit the ground about 10 feet to my right. It wasn't a small pebble, this was a rock the size of my fist. Then another one landed closer, just a few feet away. I quickened my pace, keeping my weapon ready. The rocks were being thrown from different directions, as if whatever was throwing them was moving rapidly through the brush, circling me. I could hear branches breaking, heavy footfalls, but still couldn't see anything. Something large moved through the bushes, about 30 feet ahead of me, just a dark shadow against the already dim forest. It was tall, taller than a man should be out there. I raised my weapon and shouted a final warning. The movement stopped, and there was this tense moment of absolute silence. Then came the most chilling sound I've ever heard, a low, deliberate, almost human-like breath that seemed to come from something with lungs twice the size of mine. I maintained my pace, not running but moving steadily toward my truck. The rocks had stopped, but I could sense movement paralleling me in the woods. Whatever it was pacing me, staying just out of clear sight. When I finally reached the tree line and saw my truck, I felt this wave of relief that almost made my knees buckle. I backed out of the woods, weapon still drawn, until I reached my vehicle. I unlocked it with my free hand, got in, and locked the doors immediately. As I sat there catching my breath, I scanned the edge of the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw nothing. Then I noticed a section of the brush about 50 yards down the tree line moving slightly, not like wind, like something large was standing there watching me. I started the engine and flipped on my light bar, illuminating the forest edge. For just a split second, I thought I saw something tall step back into the deeper shadows, something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't shaped quite right for a human. I put the truck in drive and got the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I've dealt with dangerous people before, domestic abusers, drugged-up suspects, even armed confrontations. But nothing has ever affected me like this. When I got back to the station, I didn't know what to put in my report. How do you explain something you can't identify? I ended up writing that I'd encountered possible trespassers who fled into the woods and recommended a larger team return during daylight hours. My sergeant must have seen something in my face because he pulled me into his office and asked what really happened. I told him everything. He didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just listened, then told me he'd heard similar stories from that area over the years. He decided we'd send 4 officers the next day. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that growl, felt it vibrating in my chest. I kept seeing that shadow at the forest edge, the way it moved, not quite human, not quite animal. The next day, I went back with 3 other officers. We searched for hours and found nothing except for a few broken branches and some odd impressions in the soft ground that might have been footprints, but were too distorted to make out clearly. One thing we did find was a tree with the bark splintered about 8 feet up, like something had hit it with tremendous force. It's been 4 days now, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched in those woods. I'm an experienced officer. I've hunted these forests my whole life. I know what bears sound like, what people sound like. This was neither. I've never told anyone this part, but when I heard that breathing, that deliberate, controlled breathing, it felt intelligent. Not just animal instinct, but something calculating, something that was making decisions about how to respond to me. I vowed that day I'd never go back to that part of the forest alone, not even armed. In all my years of law enforcement dealing with the worst people can offer, nothing has left me as deeply unsettled as whatever was in those woods. The craziest part? 3 days after our search, an older guy who lives near that property came into the station. Without prompting, he described hearing the exact same tree-slamming sounds I'd heard, followed by what he called whooping late that night. He's lived there 20 years and said he'd never heard anything like it before. I don't know what's out there in those woods west of Broken Bow. I just know that in 5 years of police work, that's the only time I've ever drawn my weapon and the only time I've ever felt truly afraid on duty. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered in these forests. Sometimes when I'm on night patrol and drive past those woods, I still get this feeling like something's watching from the tree line. I keep my window up now. Story 4. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. 7 years now, and I still question what I saw that day. I'm a lifelong hunter, grew up in Alabama, been in those woods since I could walk. I know what bears look like, I know what people in ghillie suits look like. This wasn't either of those things. It was January 2016, one of those winter afternoons where the sky stays clear, but the cold cuts right through you. I'd been planning this hunting trip for weeks, just a simple day out in the woods outside Decatur. Nothing special. I've hunted those woods dozens of times before. I parked my truck at one of the old logging road entrances around 3 in the afternoon. I remember checking my watch and thinking I had about 3 hours of good daylight left. I grabbed my rifle, a Remington 308 I've had for years, packed some water, my hunting knife and a couple protein bars. Standard stuff. The woods were quiet that day. Too quiet, looking back on it. Usually you hear squirrels rustling in the leaves or birds calling overhead. But there was this stillness that I didn't pay much attention to at the time. I walked about half an hour down this old logging trail I knew well, looking for a good spot to set up. The trail was overgrown in places, branches scratching at my jacket as I pushed through. I found a decent spot near the edge of a clearing, with good visibility of a small basin area where deer often come through in the late afternoon. I settled in against the base of an old oak tree, positioned my rifle across my lap, and just sat there, breathing in the cold air, watching the woods. That's the part of hunting most people don't get. The waiting, the stillness, becoming part of the forest. I'd been sitting there maybe 45 minutes when I first heard it, the sound of brush breaking near the creek about 150 yards to my right. At first I thought, finally, a deer. The sound was too deliberate for a squirrel, too heavy for most smaller animals, but it wasn't quite right for deer either. Deer move with a certain rhythm, and this was different, more purposeful. I stayed still, waiting to see if whatever it was would emerge into my line of sight. After a few minutes with no visual, curiosity got the better of me. I slowly stood up, keeping my movements minimal, and decided to move closer to investigate. I remember thinking it might be a buck, maybe a big one, and I didn't want to miss my chance. I crept forward, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. The dried leaves still crunched under my boots, but I moved slowly enough that it wouldn't spook anything nearby. As I got closer to where I'd heard the noise, maybe 100 yards from my original spot, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something was moving through a patch of trees about 80 yards to my left. Just shadows at first, something big shifting between the trunks. I froze, brought my rifle up slowly, not to shoot, but to use the scope to get a better look. What I saw through that scope made my blood run cold. Between 2 pine trees stood something, not a deer, not a bear, not a human. It was massive, standing upright on 2 legs. The creature had thick, dark hair covering its body, dense across its chest and arms. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, much wider than any human I've ever seen, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. The proportions were all wrong for a person. The face is what still haunts me. It wasn't clearly visible, partially obscured by hair, but I could make out a sloped forehead that seemed to connect almost directly to the shoulders, with no visible neck. The eyes were deep set, shadowed under that prominent brow, but I could feel it looking around, scanning the forest. I remember my hands starting to shake as I held the rifle. I had to consciously steady my breathing to keep the scope from bouncing. The creature seemed restless, shifting its weight repeatedly, bending its knees slightly, then straightening again, like it was uncomfortable being still. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute, I watched it through my scope, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Part of me thought about taking a shot, not to kill it, just to confirm what I was seeing was real. But something deep inside told me that would be the worst mistake of my life. Then it moved. The creature stepped away from the trees and began walking across the open basin, completely exposed now. I could see its full height, easily over 7 feet tall. Its stride was long and fluid, covering ground quickly without seeming to hurry. Those arms swung low with each step, a motion that looked so unnatural compared to human walking. The most unsettling part was that it occasionally turned its head to look back in my direction. Not directly at me. I was partially concealed, but toward my general area, like it knew something was watching it. Each time it turned, I felt exposed, like it could see right through the brush to where I was crouching. The hair on its body was mostly dark brown, almost black in places, especially across the back. But where the late afternoon sun hit it, there were reddish highlights, like dark copper. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you'd expect on a wild animal. It hung fairly straight, moving slightly with each step. I watched as it walked toward the distant timberline, moving with purpose, like it had somewhere specific to be. When it reached the edge of the trees, it paused for just a moment, turned once more in my direction, then disappeared into the shadows. The moment it was gone, my body unfroze. My legs were cramping from staying in one position, and my hands were stiff around the rifle. I felt cold sweat running down my back despite the January chill. I waited maybe 5 minutes, listening intently for any sound of it returning, before I decided to get the hell out of there. I didn't run. Running in the woods is asking for trouble. But I walked as fast as I safely could back toward the logging trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me whip around, rifle half raised. The woods that had been so familiar to me my entire life suddenly felt alien and threatening. The walk back to my truck took half the time as my journey in. I kept thinking I heard something following me, but whenever I stopped to listen, there was nothing. Just that unnatural silence that had been there all along. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw my rifle onto the passenger seat, jumped in, and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a few minutes, just breathing, trying to process what I'd seen. I've spent countless hours in those woods. I've seen bears, coyotes, bobcats, every kind of deer in Alabama. What I saw that day wasn't any of those things. The way it moved, the proportions of its body, the deliberate way it walked. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and it sure as hell wasn't a human. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot outside Decatur. I'd be laughed out of town, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a man in a suit. No costume could move that naturally while being that unnatural, if that makes any sense. The muscle movements under the hair were fluid. The joints bent in ways that seemed both familiar and wrong. I've gone back to those woods since then, but never alone, and never to that same spot. I bring my hunting buddies, always make sure someone knows exactly where I am. I carry a sidearm now in addition to my rifle. Some of my friends noticed the change, asked why I seemed jumpy in the woods lately. I just tell them I had a close call with a black bear. It's easier than the truth. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's the fact that it saw me too. Those moments when it looked back in my direction, I can't shake the feeling that it knew exactly where I was, exactly what I was doing, and it chose to walk away. I've researched similar sightings in the area since then. There have been a few reports over the years, nothing major hitting the news, but enough whispers among locals to make me think I'm not the only one. Hunters talk. And sometimes, after enough beers around a campfire, the stories that come out sound a lot like mine. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists, and it's out there in woods where I've spent my entire life feeling at home. Now every time I'm out there and the woods go quiet, I wonder if it's watching me again. I still hunt, still spend time outdoors. I won't let one experience, no matter how terrifying, take that away from me. But I'm more alert now, more aware of my surroundings. And sometimes, when I'm sitting against a tree waiting for deer, I find myself raising my scope to scan the tree line, looking not for antlers, but for something standing upright where it shouldn't be. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for whatever reason it let me see it. Maybe it was curious about me too. Maybe it was just passing through, or maybe it was sending me a message that I'm not at the top of the food chain in those woods, and I never was. Story 5. I still can't believe what I saw that day. It's been over 40 years, but the memory is seared into my brain like it happened yesterday. I've spent my whole life in law enforcement and security work, seen just about everything you can imagine, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered on that September afternoon in 1980. I was working as a reserve deputy sheriff in Gold Hill, Nevada, and also held a position as security supervisor for the Houston International Minerals Corporation. It was a good gig, kept me busy, paid the bills, and I got to spend time outdoors in some beautiful country. The mining operation was pretty extensive, spanning several ridges and valleys in the area, and part of my job was training new security personnel and familiarizing them with the property boundaries. On September 15th, I was showing a new swing shift officer around the perimeter. It was around 4:15 in the afternoon, clear skies, temperature in the mid-70s, a perfect Nevada day. We had parked our vehicle on an access road that ran along one of the ridgelines overlooking a ravine where a small creek ran. The area had some sparse trees, mostly scrubby pines, and a few cottonwoods near the water, with large rock outcroppings scattered across the slopes. We were standing by the truck, drinking coffee from my thermos and pointing out landmarks, when we noticed a group of teenagers making their way down into the ravine. There were already some girls down there, probably high school kids from Virginia City or Gold Hill, just hanging out after school. When the boys arrived, the whole group erupted in typical teenage fashion, laughing, shouting, splashing in the creek. You know how kids are. The sound carried up to us clearly in the still afternoon air. I remember thinking we might need to go down there and check if they were on mining property, but that's when something caught my eye. At first, I thought the commotion had startled a deer from near one of the rock outcroppings about 200 yards across the ravine, but almost immediately, I realized whatever was moving was way too big to be a deer. "You see that?" I asked my trainee, whose name was Bill. "See what?" he said, squinting across the distance. I always kept a pair of decent binoculars in my truck. I grabbed them and focused on the movement. What I saw through those lenses turned my blood to ice. An upright figure was climbing through the sparse tree cover on the upper slope of the opposite ridge. When I say upright, I mean completely bipedal, walking on two legs like a human, except this was no human. The creature was massive, heavily built with shoulders that must have been at least 3 feet across. Its limbs were thick and muscular, and it moved with purpose, not struggling at all with the steep incline. The thing that struck me most was that it was covered head to toe in hair. Not fur exactly. It didn't look like a bear or any other animal I'd ever seen. The hair varied in color, mostly brown with patches of gray, almost like the hair of a man in his 50s who's starting to go gray at the temples. But this was no man in a suit. The movement was too fluid, too natural. "Here," I said, handing the binoculars to Bill. Tell me what you see on that far ridge." He took them and adjusted the focus. After a few seconds, he lowered them slowly. His face had gone pale. "What the hell is that thing?" he whispered. The creature reached the top of the hill and paused. For about a minute, it just stood there, completely still, facing back down toward the ravine where all the noise was coming from. It seemed to be observing, listening. Then it turned away from us and disappeared over the ridge with a stride that indicated tremendous strength and an ease of movement that was unsettling. There was something deliberate about how it moved. Not rushing, not scared, just purposeful. I've spent years in the backcountry. I know every animal native to Nevada. This wasn't any of them. It wasn't a bear rearing up, wasn't an elk, wasn't anything I could categorize or explain away. "We need to check this out," I told Bill, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. We got in the truck and drove around to where we could access the area where I'd spotted the creature. It took us about 35 minutes to get there, so it was around 10 minutes to 5 when we arrived at the spot. We parked and approached cautiously. I had my service weapon, and Bill was carrying two, but I sincerely hoped we wouldn't need to use them. The ground was mostly gravelly soil mixed with rock, not great for tracking. We searched the area for about 20 minutes, but found no discernible footprints. What we did find, though, was a way to estimate the creature's height. There was a scraggly pine tree near where it had stood, and I remembered clearly that the figure's head had been level with or slightly above the top of this tree. We measured the tree as best we could. It was around 11 feet tall. That meant whatever we'd seen was somewhere between 10 and 11 feet in height. Let that sink in for a moment. 10 to 11 feet tall, walking upright with the proportions of a human, but the size of nothing that should exist. Bill and I stood there for a long time, just staring at each other. Neither of us knew what to say. Finally, I broke the silence. "We don't report this," I said. "Not a chance," Bill agreed immediately. "Nobody would believe us anyway." But that wasn't entirely my reasoning. Something about the creature's behavior had struck me. It had been aware of the teenagers, but had chosen to move away rather than toward them. It had observed, assessed, and then deliberately left the area. That didn't strike me as the behavior of something aggressive or dangerous, at least not immediately so. We drove back to the security office in silence. I kept replaying the sighting in my head, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Could it have been someone in a costume? Absolutely not. The movement was too natural, the location too remote, and the size impossible to fake. A bear? No way. I've seen plenty of bears stand up on their hind legs, and they don't move like that, especially not over distance and rough terrain. For the next few weeks, I found excuses to patrol that same ridge at different times of day. I never saw the creature again, but I did notice something odd. The teenagers stopped hanging out in that ravine. When I asked around town, I heard rumors that some of the kids had gotten spooked by weird noises and feeling like they were being watched. They'd found a new spot to gather closer to town. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what I saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about the Sierra Nevada wood ape, about various cryptids reported across the American West. Some accounts match aspects of what I witnessed, but nothing quite captures the combination of size, movement, and that strange, almost intelligent behavior. What bothers me most, even all these years later, is the purpose. What was this creature doing there? The area has a history of mining going back to the Comstock lode days. There are old tunnels, abandoned shafts, and natural caves throughout those hills. Was it living in one of them? Was it just passing through? Did it have a territory that it patrolled, like a sentinel watching over its domain? I retired from law enforcement 15 years ago and moved to a small house outside Carson City. Sometimes, especially on clear autumn days that remind me of that September afternoon, I find myself staring at the distant ridgelines, wondering. I've never told this story publicly before, my wife knows, I told her about a year after we got married when we were camping and heard something large moving outside our tent in the middle of the night. It turned out to be a moose, but my reaction had scared her enough that I felt I needed to explain. She believes me, or at least she believes that I believe what I saw. Bill, the trainee who was with me that day, transferred to another job about 6 months later. We've stayed in loose contact over the years, Christmas cards and the occasional phone call. We never discuss what we saw, but there's an understanding between us, a shared experience that neither of us can fully process. I'm 74 years old now. I've had a good life, a normal life aside from that one inexplicable afternoon. But I find myself thinking about it more and more lately. What would have happened if we'd arrived at the ridge faster? What if we'd encountered the creature face to face? Would it have fled, or would something else have happened? And what if those teenagers had looked up at the right moment and seen what was watching them from above? The older I get, the more I wonder about the things we don't understand, the gaps in our knowledge about the world around us. We think we've catalogued and categorized everything, explained away all the mysteries, but then something like this happens, something that defies all explanation within our neat frameworks. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It wasn't any known animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was nevertheless there, as real as the ground beneath my feet and the sky above my head. Sometimes at night I still dream about it, that massive silhouette against the Nevada sky, those fluid movements that spoke of power and purpose, the way it paused at the ridgetop as if considering something important before moving on. I call it the Gold Hill Sentinel in my mind. I don't know why. Maybe because of how it stood there, watching before disappearing over the ridge. Like it was guarding something. Like it had been there long before the miners came, before the settlers, maybe even before the indigenous peoples. And sometimes, on nights when the wind blows hard across the desert and rattles my windows, I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through remote valleys and over lonely ridges, watching and waiting as the world changes around it, but it remains the same. I've never gone back to that exact spot. Part of me wants to, just to see if I can make sense of it all these years later. But another part of me, maybe the wiser part, knows that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some experience is not meant to be repeated. All I know for certain is what I saw that day in 1980, and it's something I'll carry with me for whatever time I have left. Some might call it a burden, this knowledge that the world is stranger than most people will ever know. But I've come to see it as something else, a glimpse behind the curtain. A brief moment when the ordinary gave way to the extraordinary. And in a life largely defined by routine and predictability, maybe that's something to be grateful for, even if it keeps me awake sometimes, staring out at the darkness, wondering what else might be out there, just beyond the reach of our understanding. Story 6. I still get chills thinking about what happened last Christmas. My family and I had just moved to Silverton, British Columbia, about 6 months earlier. It's a small mountain town, real quiet, surrounded by these massive forests. We'd bought this property at the edge of town. My parents fell in love with how peaceful it was, and honestly, I did too, at least at first. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Mark Thompson. I'm 23, and I live with my parents, Richard and Diana, and my younger sister Jessica, who's 19. We moved from Vancouver because my dad wanted to get away from city life after his heart scare last year. Doctors said less stress would do him good, and Mom was all for it. Jessica and I weren't thrilled about leaving our friends behind, but we both work remotely, so it wasn't the end of the world. Anyway, Christmas 2020. It had been snowing all day, that perfect, picturesque Christmas snow that makes everything look like a postcard. We'd spent the day at my aunt's place about 40 minutes away and were heading home around 10 at night. Dad was driving, Mom was in the passenger seat half asleep, and Jessica and I were in the back. The roads were pretty empty. It was dark, No streetlights out there, just our headlights cutting through the night. We were about 15 minutes from home when it happened. I was staring out the window, not really focusing on anything, when I noticed something by the side of the road up ahead. At first I thought it was a tree or something, but as we got closer, I realized it was moving. "Dad, slow down," I said, leaning forward between the front seats. "Look at that." The headlights caught it fully then, this massive figure standing upright at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark hair, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it was huge, like 7 feet tall at least. "What the hell is that?" Jessica whispered beside me. She'd seen it too. Before anyone could answer, the thing dropped to all fours in this bizarre, fluid motion that made my skin crawl. It wasn't like a bear dropping down. The proportions were all wrong. Its limbs looked too long, almost like a mixture of human and animal, and the way it moved was just wrong. I can't explain it better than that. Dad slowed the car, but didn't stop completely. The thing disappeared into the trees before we could get a better look. Did you all see that? Mom was fully awake now, twisting around to look at us. We drove the rest of the way home in this tense silence, all of us processing what we'd just witnessed. As soon as we got back to our place, we started debating what it could have been. It was probably just a bear, Dad said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't stand like that," Jessica argued, "and they don't move like that either." I agreed with her. That wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. After about 30 minutes of back and forth, Dad made a decision. "Let's go back and look. It just snowed, so if anything crossed the road there, we'll see tracks." Mom thought we were crazy, but she grabbed her coat anyway. I think curiosity got the better of all of us. We piled back into the car and drove to where we'd seen the figure. Dad parked on the shoulder and we all got out, flashlights in hand. It was freezing cold, the kind that bites at your face and makes your ears ache. The snow was coming down lightly now, but it was fresh enough that any tracks would still be visible. "Over here," Jessica called out. She was pointing her flashlight at the ground near where we'd seen the figure. We all gathered around, and what we saw made my stomach drop. There were tracks crossing the road, huge elongated footprints that disappeared into the forest on both sides. They were significantly longer than a human foot, with what looked like 5 toes. The stride length was massive too. Whoever or whatever made these tracks had to be taking steps twice as long as mine. "These aren't bear tracks," Mom whispered, her voice shaking slightly. Dad pulled out his phone and started taking pictures and a video of the tracks. I did the same. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. It felt like we were being watched. "Look at the depth of these," Dad said, crouching down next to one of the prints. "Whatever made these has to be heavy." Something about the footprints seemed deliberate. They weren't the random path of an animal. They were in a straight line, like something that knew exactly where it was going. "Should we follow them?" I asked, immediately regretting the suggestion. To my surprise, Dad nodded. "Just a little way in. We'll stay together." Mom looked like she wanted to object, but didn't. Jessica seemed excited, which was typical for her. She's always been the adventurous one. We followed the tracks into the forest, our flashlights creating eerie shadows between the trees. The snow muffled our footsteps, making everything unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The tracks led us about 50 yards into the forest before taking a sharp turn northward, parallel to the road. We followed for another few minutes until Dad suddenly stopped. "Listen," he whispered. We all froze. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then it hit me, the complete absence of sound. The forest was dead silent in a way that felt wrong, like everything was holding its breath. Then Jessica grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "Something's watching us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I felt it too, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. My heart started racing, and I had this overwhelming urge to run. Dad must have felt the same because he said, "I think we should head back to the car." We turned around and started walking back, much faster than we'd come in. No one wanted to run. It felt like if we ran, something would chase us, but we were definitely hurrying. Just as we reached the edge of the forest, a sound cut through the silence. A long, deep vocalization that wasn't quite a howl and wasn't quite a scream. It sounded almost like a whale's call, but deeper, more guttural, and it echoed through the trees. It didn't sound fully animal or human. It was something in between. We practically sprinted back to the car after that. Dad fumbled with the keys for what felt like ages before we finally got in and locked the doors. As we pulled away, I looked back at the forest through the rear window. I didn't see anything move, but the feeling of being watched didn't subside until we were miles away. When we got home, we all sat around the kitchen table, shaken. That's when Jessica brought up the other weird things we'd been noticing since moving to Silverton. "Remember those strange structures we found in the woods behind our house last month?" she asked. I knew exactly what she was talking about. About a month after moving in, Jessica and I had been exploring the forest behind our property when we came across these bizarre arrangements of branches and small trees. They were too deliberate to be natural, sticks and branches woven together in these teepee-like structures. At the time, we figured some local kids had built them, but now I wasn't so sure. "And what about those sounds we've been hearing at night?" Mom added quietly. For the past few months, we'd occasionally hear strange calls in the distance, always late at night. We'd written them off as coyotes or maybe an elk, but they never sounded quite right. Too structured, almost like they were communicating something. We stayed up late that night, sharing stories we'd heard about Sasquatch and Bigfoot. Dad pulled up the photos and videos we'd taken of the tracks on his phone. The footprints were clear in the pictures. About 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, much larger than any human foot. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the image of that figure dropping to all fours, the unnatural way it moved. I found myself getting up several times to look out my window toward the forest, half expecting to see something staring back at me from between the trees. The next morning, Dad and I went back to the spot. The snow had continued overnight, but you could still make out the indentations where the tracks had been. We followed them a bit further into the forest this time, and that's when we found it. A clump of dark, coarse hair caught on a low-hanging branch. Dad carefully collected it in a plastic bag. We never got the hair analyzed. Part of me didn't want to know for sure. Some things are better left mysterious, I guess. It's been almost a year now, and we still live in that house. But our relationship with the surrounding forest has changed completely. We don't go hiking alone anymore. We installed better outdoor lighting and security cameras, and sometimes on quiet nights, we still hear those strange calls echoing through the trees. I'm not saying I know what we saw that Christmas night, but I am saying that whatever it wasn't something that's supposed to exist according to science. It was intelligent enough to move with purpose, strong enough to leave deep impressions in packed snow, and silent enough to disappear without a trace when it wanted to. Sometimes I catch myself staring out at the tree line, wondering if it's out there watching us, wondering if it knows we saw it, wondering what would have happened if we'd stayed in those woods just a little longer on Christmas night. I used to think these forests were empty. Now I know better. There's something out there in the woods around Silverton, something large, something smart, and something that doesn't want to be found. And the most terrifying part, I think it's been watching us this whole time. Story 7. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day in the summer of 2005. I've told this story to a handful of people, and most think I'm either crazy or making it up for attention, but I know what I saw, and I'm sharing it now because I need to get it off my chest. My girlfriend Jess and I were riding my Honda four-wheeler along the Tilton River bottoms outside of Morton, Washington. It was late July, warm but not hot. Perfect weather for exploring. We'd been dating for about 8 months, and she was finally getting comfortable with our weekend adventures into the more remote areas. I'd grown up hunting these woods with my dad, so I knew the terrain pretty well. We'd spent most of the afternoon just cruising the old logging roads and game trails. Around 4 in the afternoon, we stopped to watch a small group of deer grazing in a clearing about 50 yards away. I cut the engine so we wouldn't spook them, and we just sat there for maybe 15 minutes, watching them through my binoculars. After the deer wandered off, we decided to head down to one of my favorite spots, a bend in the Tilton River where the water slows down and creates this peaceful little area. It's tucked away from the main trails, and not many people know about it. We parked the four-wheeler on a small patch of gravel and walked the last 30 yards to the riverbank. The spot is beautiful. Tall trees create a canopy overhead, letting dappled sunlight through. The river makes this gentle rushing sound as it curves around the bend, and there are these massive old fallen logs that make perfect natural benches. We sat down on one of those logs, and Jess leaned her head against my shoulder. It was one of those perfect moments, you know? Just peaceful. I remember checking my watch. It was around 5:30 in the afternoon. The sun was still up, but starting to get lower in the sky, creating these long shadows across the water. We weren't talking much, just soaking in the sounds of the forest, birds calling, the water flowing, an occasional splash from a fish jumping. That's when I noticed something unusual on the opposite bank. The river isn't very wide at that point, maybe 75 yards across. The other side has this dense growth of young saplings and underbrush that runs up to the tree line of the older forest. I saw movement, something orange moving behind the saplings. At first I thought it might be another deer, maybe with a reddish summer coat, but the color was wrong. This was a deep, rusty orange, almost like old rust on a car, but more vibrant. I nudged Jess and whispered, "Hey, look over there, something's moving." She squinted, but couldn't make it out. I reached for my backpack and pulled out my binoculars. When I focused them on the spot, my heart literally skipped a beat. Through the glasses, I could see it was on all fours initially, moving slowly behind the thin trees. But what struck me was the hair, this thick, rusty orange hair covering its body and its face. God, its face was pale, almost white in comparison to the rest of it. Not like fur, but skin, actual skin. My hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold the binoculars steady. I remember my mouth going completely dry and this cold feeling washing over me despite the warm day. "What is it?" Jess whispered, picking up on my tension. I couldn't answer right away. I was trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. The movement was all wrong, and bears don't have that coloration. It wasn't a deer or an elk. It wasn't any animal I recognized from my years of hunting in these woods. "I don't know," I finally managed to say, "but I'm going to film it." I always kept a small digital camcorder in my backpack for recording our trips. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and started recording, trying to zoom in as much as possible on that spot across the river. As I was focusing the camera, the creature seemed to sense it was being watched. It stopped moving, and slowly, I mean painfully slowly, it rose up on 2 legs. My stomach dropped. Standing upright, it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. I was frozen in place, still filming, not even sure if I was getting anything useful because my hands were shaking so badly. The creature stayed perfectly still for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. Then it moved. Not slowly anymore, but with shocking speed. It lunged forward toward a fallen tree, vaulted over it in one fluid motion, and disappeared into the thicker brush behind. The whole movement took maybe 3 seconds. All my camera caught was the violent shaking of a large branch where it had crossed. "Did you see that?" I gasped, turning to Jess. She was looking at me with confusion. "See what? The branch moving?" She hadn't seen the creature at all, just the aftermath of its movement through the brush. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my words came out jumbled and panicky. I was pointing at the spot, rewinding the camera footage to show her, but the video was so shaky and unclear that it showed almost nothing, just forest and then a branch moving. "We need to go," I said, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. The peaceful spot now felt threatening, like we were being watched. Now. We hustled back to the four-wheeler, and I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Jess thought I was overreacting, but she didn't argue. The ride back was tense. I kept the speed up, taking the trails faster than I should have. Every shadow in the forest seemed to hide something watching us. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. Jess held onto me tight, sensing my fear, even if she didn't understand it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind. The orange hair, the pale face, the unnatural speed and fluidity of its movement. I've been a hunter all my life. I know what bears look like, what cougars look like, what every native animal to these woods looks like. This was something else entirely. The next morning, I called my hunting buddy, Mike. He's the most level-headed guy I know, and I trusted him not to think I was completely insane. I told him what happened, and though I could hear the skepticism in his voice, he agreed to go back to the spot with me. We went without Jess. I brought my rifle this time. Not that I planned to shoot anything, but it made me feel safer. We crossed the river at a shallow point about a quarter-mile upstream and made our way to where I'd seen the creature. The brush was thick, making it hard to navigate, but we eventually found the fallen tree I'd seen it jump over, and that's when Mike found something that made my blood run cold. Fresh scat, not from any animal he recognized either. It was huge, almost like a bear's, but different somehow, and in it were these coarse black hairs, not orange like what I'd seen, but definitely not from any local wildlife we knew of. Mike took samples in a plastic bag. He's always been the scientific type. He was still skeptical, but admitted that something unusual had been there. We searched the area for tracks, but found nothing definitive. Just some broken branches and disturbed vegetation that could have been caused by anything. When we got back to town, Mike said he'd send the hair samples to a friend of his who worked in a lab at the university. I never heard what came of that. I think Mike eventually convinced himself it was just some unusual bear scat, and he didn't want to seem like he was buying into a Bigfoot story. But I know what I saw. In the years since, I've gone back to that spot dozens of times. I've set up game cameras in the trees, hoping to catch another glimpse. Most of the time, they just capture deer and the occasional black bear. But every now and then, I get something strange. Large shapes moving at the edge of the frame, or unnaturally high eye shine that doesn't match any known animal. I've become somewhat obsessed with monitoring that area of the Tilton River bottoms. I've mapped out game trails, noted unusual tree breaks, collected scat samples myself. My girlfriend eventually became my ex. She said my Bigfoot obsession was too much. Maybe she was right. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Whatever I saw that day, I'm convinced it's still out there. I've heard strange vocalizations at dusk. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream. Something in between that makes the hair on my arms stand up. I've found broken trees that would take immense strength to snap, and twice I've found those same orange hairs caught on brush, though never enough to make a conclusive DNA sample. The locals around Morton have their stories. Most won't talk about them openly for fear of ridicule, but after a few beers at the local bar, you'll hear whispers, stories of strange sounds in the night, of pets going missing, of feeling watched while hunting. Last fall, I was setting up a new game camera near the original spot. It was getting dark, and I was hurrying to finish before I lost daylight completely. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just absolute silence except for the gentle flow of the river. I slowly turned around, scanning the trees behind me, and there, about 100 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive cedar, I saw that same rusty orange color. Just for a second before it moved back into deeper cover. I didn't have my binoculars or camera ready, just my eyes, and the fading light, and that distinctive orange patch moving in a way no known animal moves. I didn't run, I didn't call out. I just finished mounting the camera with shaking hands, then walked, didn't run, just walked, back to my truck, the whole time feeling those eyes on my back. The game camera captured nothing that night, but I know what I saw. I know it's out there, watching, living its life in the remote areas along the Tilton River that humans rarely visit. That orange Sasquatch, as I've come to think of it, is real. I've seen it twice now with my own eyes. I don't expect you to believe me. Most people don't. But if you're ever in the Tilton River bottoms outside of Morton, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust that feeling. Look carefully at the shadows between the trees, and maybe, just maybe, you'll catch a glimpse of something rusty orange moving in a way that defies explanation. I'll be back there next weekend, checking my cameras. I always go back. I can't not go, because I need to know I'm not crazy. I need proof of what I saw that day in 2005. And someday, I'm going to get it. Story 8. I still can't sleep when I drive that stretch of Highway 5 and 50 at night. It's been nearly 20 years, but every time I hit that level stretch south of Ridgeway, my hands grip the wheel a little tighter, and my eyes scan the tree line like I'm expecting something to step out again. Most of the guys I work with think I'm crazy. Hell, I would have thought the same thing before it happened. It was late March 2004. I remember because it was right after my daughter's birthday. I was hauling a full load of potatoes southbound through western Colorado. Night driving was always my preference. Less traffic, cooler temperatures, and the roads feel like they belong just to you. I'd been on the road about 14 hours already, but I wasn't tired. I had my thermos of coffee and was playing some old Merle Haggard cassettes to keep me company. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I hit that stretch south of Ridgeway. Anyone who drives that route knows it. You climb this long incline, then you get this brief flat section before the road drops and curves back down. There had been a storm earlier, and patches of snow still covered the ground on either side of the highway. The moon was bright that night, almost full, casting this silver-blue light across the landscape. I remember noticing this wisp of fog up ahead. Nothing unusual. These little fog patches form in the mountains all the time, especially after snow. But as I got closer, it seemed to thicken up real quick. 1 second I could see clear through it, and the next it was like driving into a cloud. I slowed down a bit. Not too much, just enough to be cautious. 18 wheels on mountain roads demands respect. That's when I caught it. Eyeshine in my headlights, off to the right side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. We get them all the time, and they're a real hazard on mountain highways. I flipped my high beams on to get a better look, thinking if it was a deer, the brighter light might freeze it in place until I passed. What stepped onto that highway wasn't a deer, not even close. It moved from the tree line onto the asphalt in what seemed like slow motion, though it must have only been a couple of seconds. The thing was massive. I mean properly massive. I've been a trucker for 27 years, and I've seen pretty much everything on the roads. Elk, moose, even a couple of bears. But this thing made them all look small. It stood upright, walking on 2 legs like a man, but it had to be between 8 and 10 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, and its torso looked solid as a tree trunk. The body wasn't lanky or skinny, like you might imagine a tall creature to be. This thing was built like one of those professional weightlifters, but bigger. I'd guess it weighed 700 or 800 pounds at least. The whole body was covered in this dark hair, black or maybe very dark brown, hard to tell in the headlights. The hair wasn't short and fuzzy like a bear's. It hung in these long, heavy strands, especially from its arms and across its back. When it moved, the hair swayed slightly, almost like it was wet or really dense. Its face is what I remember most clearly. I only saw it for a split second when it turned toward my truck, but those features are burned into my memory. Heavy, thick eyebrows jutted out over deep-set eyes that caught my headlights and reflected back at me. The face reminded me of pictures I'd seen of gorillas, but different somehow. More expressive, more aware. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that size to be. It crossed the entire width of the highway in just 2 strides. 2! Its arms swung naturally at its sides, not like an ape dragging its knuckles, but like a person walking with purpose. There was something deliberate about the way it moved, like it knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing. The worst part was when it looked directly at me, not a glance. It turned its head and stared right at me through my windshield. There was intelligence in those eyes, recognition, like it was assessing me just as much as I was trying to make sense of it. I had to swerve hard to avoid hitting it, even though it had already cleared most of the road. My trailer started to rock dangerously, and I felt the tires lock up for a second. The load shifted, and for one terrifying moment, I thought I was going to jackknife or roll. Somehow I managed to straighten out, but my heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I pulled over as soon as I could, maybe a quarter mile down the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the truck in park. I sat there, engine idling, scanning my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see that thing loping down the highway after me. The cab lights were on, and I suddenly felt exposed, like I was sitting in a fishbowl. I quickly shut them off and sat in the dark, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. Part of me wanted to back up and look for tracks in that fresh snow. The rational part of my brain was saying maybe it was just a weird shadow or my tired mind playing tricks. But I knew better. I've spent my whole life outdoors, hunting, fishing, camping. I know what animals look like. I know what people look like. This wasn't either of those things. Not exactly. I didn't get out of that truck. No way in hell. I sat there for maybe 15 minutes, trying to calm down enough to drive again. Every sound from the forest made me jump. A branch creaking in the wind, an owl hooting somewhere in the distance. I kept thinking about how easily that thing had crossed the road, how it didn't seem frightened by my truck at all. Most wildlife will run from vehicles, especially something as loud as my semi. But this thing just crossed like my truck wasn't even there, like it was just going somewhere it needed to be. When I finally got back on the road, I didn't stop again until I was well into New Mexico. I stayed wide awake the whole way, even though I'd already been driving for hours. Every shadow on the roadside looked like it might be that creature. Every patch of darkness between the trees seemed to hide those eyes. The crazy thing is, before this happened, I used to laugh at Bigfoot stories. My stepfather once told me about something he saw while elk hunting years back, and I remember thinking he'd had too much whiskey around the campfire. I'd smile and nod whenever some local in a diner would talk about strange things in the woods. Now I don't laugh anymore. I didn't report it officially. What was I gonna say? Hey officer, I just saw Bigfoot cross Highway 550. They'd have breathalyzed me on the spot. I told my wife when I got home, and she listened patiently, but I could tell she thought I was exhausted and seeing things. I mentioned it to a couple of other truckers I trust and got mixed reactions. Some interest, some eye rolls. One guy, Tom, told me that Stretch of the San Juans has had stories for years, but most drivers don't talk about them for fear of being labeled crazy. I've tried to make sense of what I saw ever since. I've looked up bears walking on hind legs, moose in poor light, even guys in costumes. Nothing matches. Nothing comes close to the size, the movement, the deliberate way it crossed that road. I've read about grizzlies. They can stand up to 8 feet and weigh 800 pounds, but they don't walk distances on 2 legs, and they don't have that silhouette. This was no bear. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through those mountains at night when most people are asleep. I wonder if it watches the highway and the trucks passing by. I wonder if it remembers me the way I remember it. I've driven that route hundreds of times since then, always in daylight when I can manage it. I've slowed down at that exact spot, looking for any sign, broken branches, unusual tracks, anything that might confirm what I saw. I never found anything concrete, but sometimes, especially in winter when the trees are bare, I get this feeling like something's watching from just beyond the tree line. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone told me the same story, but I know what I saw. It was real. It was massive, and it was aware. It moved with purpose and intelligence, and sometimes, when I'm driving at night and hit a patch of fog, I find myself holding my breath, watching the side of the road, wondering if I'll see those eyes again. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for years. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake a little. This happened in October 1982, behind Roosevelt Elementary in Salt Lake City. I was 17 then, and my girlfriend Emma was 16. It was a Tuesday night, around 9 or 10. We weren't supposed to be there, obviously. The school was closed, but we'd sneak behind it sometimes just to have a place to ourselves. We were young and thought we were invincible. God, I wish I could go back and warn myself. The field behind the school was our spot. It wasn't anything special, just an empty lot with patchy grass that backed up to some trees and a small hill. There was a chain-link fence around the school property, but it had a hole we could slip through. We'd been there dozens of times before. That night was chilly, typical Utah October weather. A light mist was falling, not quite rain, but enough to make everything damp. We'd brought an old blanket to sit on, but the ground was already getting muddy. Emma had this oversized denim jacket she always wore, and I remember her pulling it tighter around herself as we sat there. We weren't doing anything crazy, just talking and listening to music on my little cassette player. I had brought some beers I'd stolen from my dad's fridge, but we'd only had one each. I want to be clear about that. What happened wasn't because we were drunk or high or anything. We were completely sober. It must have been around 10:30 when things started feeling wrong. The first thing I noticed was the crickets. They'd been chirping non-stop all evening, but suddenly they just stopped. All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The tape in my player had just ended, so when the crickets went quiet, the silence felt overwhelming. I remember asking Emma if she noticed it too. She nodded, and that's when I saw the goosebumps on her arms. At first, I thought she was just cold, but then I felt it too, this prickly sensation running up the back of my neck. It was like every hair on my body was trying to stand up at once. The air felt heavy, like right before a thunderstorm, but different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. Emma and I looked at each other, and I could see she was feeling it too. Her eyes were wide, uncertain. "Maybe we should go," she whispered. I nodded, but neither of us moved. It was like we were frozen there listening to the silence. Then Emma's hand grabbed mine, hard. Her fingernails dug into my palm, and I turned to look at her. She wasn't looking at me, though. She was staring over my shoulder, her face drained of all color. I'll never forget the look in her eyes. Pure animal fear. The kind of fear humans aren't supposed to feel anymore in our safe, modern world. I turned around slowly, following her gaze. About 200 feet away, at the edge where the field met the trees, something was moving. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was dark, but there was just enough light from the distant street lamps for me to see a shape crawling out from the shadows. Not crawling like a child would crawl. This thing was slithering, inching forward on its stomach, flat against the ground. It was dark-colored, not black, but a deep, muddy brown like wet soil. It was hard to tell its size from that distance, but it looked roughly human-sized. It had no clothes. That detail stuck with me for some reason. It was naked, but it didn't look like skin either. More like it was covered in something slick. The way it moved was all wrong. Its arms were tucked in close to its sides, not helping it move at all. It was using just its legs, bending its knees in this bizarre, jerky way to push itself forward along the ground. Each movement sent a little ripple through its body. Push, slide, push, slide. For a few seconds we just stared at it, trying to process what we were seeing. I remember thinking it must be someone playing a prank, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't human. Nothing human moves like that. Then it stopped, and it raised its head. Even from that distance, I could see its face wasn't right. Where eyes should have been, there were just holes, black, empty pools that seemed to suck in what little light there was. They weren't reflective like animal eyes at night. They were the opposite, like looking into two tiny black holes. I couldn't see a mouth or nose, just those terrible eye sockets fixed directly on us. I know it saw us. I know it knew we were there. For one horrible moment, everything was completely still. The thing staring at us staring back, the mist falling silently around us. Then Emma screamed. Not a horror movie scream. This was something primal, a short, strangled sound, like her body was trying to reject what her eyes were seeing. That broke the spell. We both jumped up at the same instant. The blanket, the cassette player, the beers. We left everything. My car was parked about 50 feet away on the street, and we ran for it like our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. I remember fumbling with my keys, dropping them in the mud, Emma sobbing as I picked them up with shaking hands. I kept looking back over my shoulder, terrified that thing would be right behind us, but I couldn't see it anymore. Somehow, that was worse. I finally got the door unlocked, and we both scrambled inside. I started the engine and peeled out so fast the tires spun in the mud before catching. I didn't slow down until we were miles away. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. Not then. Emma just cried quietly in the passenger seat while I drove aimlessly around the city, too scared to stop anywhere, too scared to go home. When I finally dropped her off at her house around midnight, she made me promise to call her as soon as I got home. I did, and we stayed on the phone for hours, neither of us wanting to be alone with our thoughts. The next day at school, Emma was absent. I called her house after classes, and her mom said she had a fever. When I finally saw her 2 days later, she looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She told me she hadn't slept since that night. We tried to talk about what we'd seen, but it was hard to find the words. Every explanation we came up with, a homeless person, an animal, a student playing a prank, felt hollow. None of them fit what we'd witnessed. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the field in broad daylight. I didn't go alone. I brought my friend Mark, though I didn't tell him why we were really there. I just said I'd lost something. The muddy ground had dried, but there were still marks where that thing had been. Not footprints exactly, more like long, smooth depressions in the dirt, with strange indentations at regular intervals that might have been from its knees pushing down. The marks led from the trees to about where we'd seen it stop, then disappeared, like it had simply vanished or somehow lifted off the ground. Mark asked me what I was looking at, and I just shrugged it off. I never told him. I never told anyone except Emma. Emma and I broke up a month later, not because of any relationship problems, but because neither of us could look at each other without remembering that night. Every time we were together, there was this unspoken thing between us, this shared trauma we couldn't process. I still live in Salt Lake City. Sometimes I drive past Roosevelt Elementary and look at that field. I've never gone back there after dark. I never will. Over the years, I've done research, trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read about cryptids, about skinwalkers, about all kinds of paranormal phenomena. Nothing quite matches. The closest I've come is some obscure folklore about crawlers, beings that move on all fours in unnatural ways. But even those descriptions don't quite capture what we witnessed. I've wondered if maybe it was something more ordinary, a deformed animal maybe, or a human with severe disabilities who had somehow wandered into that field. But those explanations fall apart when I remember those eyes, those empty black voids that fixed on us with such terrible awareness. I'm 40 now. I have a family, a normal life. I've never told my wife about this. How could I? It sounds insane, even to me sometimes. But then I'll wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The image of that thing crawling across the mud burned into my mind like it happened yesterday. Emma moved away after high school. We lost touch for years, but I found her on social media recently. We messaged back and forth a bit, careful small talk. Neither of us mentioned that night directly, but before she stopped responding, she wrote, "I still don't sleep well when it rains at night. You know why?" I do know why. Because when the rain falls softly and the world goes quiet, it's too easy to imagine that thing out there, slithering through the darkness, its knees bending at impossible angles, its eyeless face turning toward your window. I don't know what we saw that night in October 1982. I don't think I ever will. But I know it was real. And I know that sometimes, when the crickets suddenly go silent, the smartest thing you can do is run. Story 10. I've kept this to myself for years because, honestly, who would believe me? But after finding others who've had similar experiences, I feel like I can finally share what happened that night in 1996. It still makes my skin crawl when I think about it, and I've questioned my own sanity more times than I can count. It was late November, just before Thanksgiving. My daughter Janet and I were driving back to our place near Idlewild, Michigan. The night was freezing cold, the kind that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe too deep. We'd been visiting my sister in Baldwin for dinner, and it was around 12:30 in the morning when we started heading home. I've always preferred the back roads to the main highway. They're quieter, and even though they add maybe 10 minutes to the trip, there's something peaceful about them. So instead of taking US 10, we took this winding road that cuts through the woods between Irons and Idlewild. I'd driven it hundreds of times before, knew every curve and dip like the back of my hand. That night was especially bright. The moon was nearly full, and with all the leaves gone from the trees, the moonlight filtered through the bare branches and lit up the road in this eerie blue-white glow. You could see way further into the woods than usual. Janet had dozed off in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window, breath fogging up the glass. Our old Chevy rumbled along, heater blasting, radio playing some late-night talk show I wasn't really listening to. The road there twists through these wooded hills, up and down, rising and falling past all these hidden driveways that lead to homes you can barely see from the road. Most of the summer cabins were empty that time of year, their owners long gone back to Grand Rapids or Detroit until spring. We'd just crossed over some old railroad tracks and were coming down into this curve, a spot where the road dips before rising again. My headlights swept across the landscape as we rounded the bend, and that's when I saw it. There was this old gravel driveway on the right, one I'd passed 1,000 times before. It led to a house set back behind a screen of pine trees. At the foot of that driveway, right where it met the road, was a fallen tree trunk, and sitting on that trunk was something I still can't properly explain. It was sitting there like a person would sit, hunched slightly forward, with these impossibly long arms resting on its knees. Its body was covered in this thick, coarse, dark hair. Not fur exactly, more like really long hair that looked weathered and matted in places. The thing had these massive shoulders, much broader than any man I've ever seen, and a chest that looked deep and powerful. Its head was weird, set low between those shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. I couldn't make out a face in the shadows, thank God, but I could tell it turned slightly as our headlights passed over it. The crazy thing is, it didn't run or even stand up. It just sat there, watching us pass by. I'll never forget the way my stomach dropped. It felt like someone had replaced my blood with ice water. For a split second, I actually considered stopping the car. There was this bizarre urge to turn around and take another look, like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing and needed confirmation. Janet woke up right at that moment. She must have felt me tense up or heard my breathing change because she straightened in her seat and looked out the window. When she spotted it, she let out this high-pitched scream that still rings in my ears when I think about it. "Mom, what the hell is that? Go faster!" she shrieked, grabbing my arm so hard her nails dug in. I hit the gas without thinking, and our old Chevy lurched forward. The engine complained but picked up speed, and we flew around the next curve. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following us, but there was nothing but empty road behind us. For maybe 5 minutes, we drove in complete silence. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Janet was pressed against her door like she was trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever we'd just seen. "Did you see that?" I finally whispered, not wanting to believe it myself. "What was it?" Janet's voice was shaking. She was 22 then, not a child, but she sounded like she was 10 years old again, scared of the dark. It looked like... I don't even know what it looked like. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it wasn't a bear. Bears don't sit like that." We tried to rationalize it the rest of the way home. Maybe it was a guy in a costume. But who would sit out in the freezing cold in the middle of nowhere at 12:30 in the morning wearing a costume, a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit? But hunting season was basically over, and again, who sits motionless by the road in the middle of the night? I've lived in Michigan most of my life. I know what bears look like, what deer look like, what every animal native to those woods looks like. This wasn't any of those things. It was something else entirely. The part that still haunts me is how calm it seemed. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was just sitting there, like it was taking a break or waiting for something. Like sitting by the road watching cars go by was a perfectly normal thing for it to do. When we got home, Janet went straight to her room and locked the door. I heard her on the phone with her boyfriend, voice low and urgent. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold because I couldn't bring myself to drink it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I almost convinced myself we'd imagined it. Almost. But Janet brought it up over breakfast, her eyes still wide with residual fear. "We need to tell someone," she insisted. "Maybe call the sheriff or something." But I hesitated. What would we even say? That we saw a big hairy thing sitting by the road? They'd think we were drunk or crazy or both. I ended up telling my son Mike when he came over that weekend. He just laughed and said, "Mom, it was probably just a shadow or a black bear. Your headlights can play tricks on you at night." But it wasn't a trick of the light. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a shadow. Shadows don't have broad shoulders and long arms. Shadows don't turn their heads to watch you as you drive by. For weeks afterward, I took different routes home. When I finally got the courage to drive that road again, I slowed down at that spot, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. No fallen tree trunk, no strange creature, just an ordinary gravel driveway leading to a house I could barely see through the trees. Over the years, I've driven that road hundreds more times, always watching that spot, always wondering if I'd see it again. I never have. Sometimes I wonder if that's a blessing or a disappointment. I've never told many people about this. The few I've tried to tell look at me with that mixture of pity and concern that makes you feel about 2 inches tall. But I know what I saw that night. And every time I hear stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings in Michigan, and there are more than you'd think, I get this cold feeling in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what's out there in the woods of northern Michigan. I don't know if what we saw has a name or an explanation. All I know is that for a few brief moments on a moonlit November night in 1996, my daughter and I saw something that doesn't fit into the world as we understand it. Something that sat by the roadside like a person, but definitely wasn't a person. Sometimes when I'm driving those back roads at night, I still catch myself scanning the tree line, looking into the shadows between the trees, and sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can feel something watching me back. The weirdest thing. Part of me still wishes I had stopped the car that night. What would it have done? Would it have spoken, run away, approached us? I'll never know. And maybe that's for the best. But I do know this. Whatever I saw that night was real. and it's still out there somewhere in those quiet, dark woods, sitting and watching and waiting for something. I just hope I never find out what. Story 11. I've been sitting on this story for almost 40 years now. Honestly, I never thought I'd share it publicly. Not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, but because I'm still not sure I believe it myself. But after seeing all these similar accounts popping up online lately, I figure it's time. Maybe someone out there has seen what we saw that night. It was October 1st, 1986. I remember the date clearly because we were heading back from celebrating my 23rd birthday in Burlington. My friends Carrie and George had driven up from Boston to visit me at my parents' place in Rutland County. I'd moved back home after college, trying to save some money while I figured out what to do with my life. That evening had been perfect, exactly what I needed. We'd had dinner at this little Italian place, then bar hopped until around midnight. Carrie volunteered to drive since she'd only had one beer early in the night. George was dozing in the back seat, and I was riding shotgun, fiddling with the radio. We were taking Route 4A back, which cuts through some pretty dense forest areas. The fall foliage was just starting to turn, but at night it was just dark shapes against a darker sky. Carrie had this old Chevy Impala, powder blue, complete with those huge bench seats in the front. The heater was blasting because October nights in Vermont get cold quick. The windows were slightly fogged around the edges, and I remember wiping a clear spot on my window so I could look out at the stars. The moon was nearly full, casting this eerie silver light through the trees that lined the road. We were maybe 20 minutes from my parents' place when it happened. I wasn't paying much attention to the road, just staring out at the trees and thinking about nothing in particular. Suddenly, Carrie slammed on the brakes, and I lurched forward, my seatbelt catching me hard across the chest. "Jesus Christ," she screamed. The car skidded slightly, the tires making this horrible screeching sound on the pavement. George woke up with a start in the back seat, cursing. I instinctively threw my hands up against the dashboard, and when I looked up, that's when I saw it. Standing directly in the middle of the road, illuminated by our headlights, was someone? No, definitely not someone. This thing was massive. It stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was just standing there, not moving, not reacting to our car at all, which had screeched to a halt maybe 10 feet away from it. "What the fuck is that?" George whispered from the back seat. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely. The thing was covered head to toe in thick, matted black hair. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but coarser, longer. In the harsh glare of the headlights, I could see it had this face that was almost human, but wrong. The proportions were off. High cheekbones jutted out beneath deep-set eyes that caught the light and reflected it back like a cat's or deer's. I couldn't make out a color, just these 2 points of light where eyes should be. The weirdest part, the part that still gives me chills, was how it just stood there, staring at us. It didn't flinch when our car nearly hit it. It didn't run away. It didn't do anything except stand in the middle of the road, arms hanging at its sides, watching us. I remember thinking, this isn't real, this can't be real. But I could smell a strange, musky odor even through the closed windows of the car, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. And the way the moonlight hit its silhouette when it wasn't directly in our headlights. I could see steam rising off its body in the cold air. For what felt like forever, none of us moved or spoke. Then Carrie whispered, Should I drive around it?" The creature still hadn't moved. It was maybe 10 feet in front of our car, just standing there. If my window had been down, I swear I could have reached out and touched it. That's how close we were. "Just back up," George hissed from the back seat. "Back up slowly." Carrie nodded and put the car in reverse. As we started to back away, the creature finally moved. Not much, just its head, turning slightly to follow our movement. I'll never forget those eyes tracking us. I felt like it was memorizing our faces. We backed up about 20 feet, and then Carrie quickly did a 3-point turn. I kept my eyes on the thing the whole time, afraid it would suddenly charge at us. but it just stood there watching. Once we were facing the other direction, Carrie floored it. We drove maybe half a mile down the road before she pulled over onto the shoulder, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice breaking. That couldn't have been a person, right?" George leaned forward between the front seats. "No way that was human. Did you see how tall it was? How it just stood there?" I was still struggling to process what I'd seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I think we should go back." They both stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you insane?" George asked. "That thing could be dangerous." "We need to know what it was," I insisted. I was terrified but also weirdly curious. "We can just drive by slowly, keep the doors locked. If it's still there, we'll just keep going." I don't know why I pushed for this. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe I already knew I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I didn't get another look. After some arguing, Carrie reluctantly agreed. She turned the car around and we headed back toward the spot where we'd seen the creature. The drive back seemed to take forever. We were all silent, straining to see ahead through the windshield. The road was empty and dark, except for our headlights cutting through the night. When we reached the spot, we all recognized it because there was a distinctive bent tree on one side of the road. There was nothing there. "This is definitely where it was," Carrie said, slowing the car to a crawl. "I remember that tree." We inched forward, scanning the road and the tree line on both sides. Nothing. The creature had completely vanished. There wasn't even a sign that anything had been there. No footprints on the dirt shoulder of the road, no broken branches in the underbrush. "Maybe it went into the woods," George suggested. Rolling down his window slightly to look out, I immediately noticed how quiet it was. Usually, Vermont nights are full of sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. But that night, it was completely silent, like every living thing was holding its breath. That's when I saw it again. Or at least I think I did. Just a flash of movement among the trees, maybe 50 yards into the forest. Something large, moving silently between the trunks. I grabbed Carrie's arm and pointed. "There, I saw something moving." She and George looked where I was pointing, but by then, whatever I'd seen was gone. "I don't see anything," Carrie said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Let's get out of here," George urged. "Even if it is just some guy in a costume or something, I don't want to stick around to find out." I didn't argue this time. The silence in the forest was making my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the memory of those reflective eyes staring at us. Carrie put the car in drive, and we continued home, checking the rear-view mirrors every few seconds. We stayed up the rest of the night at my parents' house. They were away visiting my sister, talking about what we'd seen. We went back and forth between rational explanations. A hunter in some kind of ghillie suit, a practical joke, a bear standing on its hind legs. But none of them fit. Bears don't stand that still, that straight. No costume I'd ever seen looked that realistic. And why would anyone be standing in the middle of a remote road at 1 in the morning? The next day, we decided to report it to the local authorities in Castleton. The officer who took our statement was polite, but clearly skeptical. He wrote everything down, asked a few questions about how much we'd had to drink, not enough to hallucinate, we assured him, and then filed the report away. I could tell from his expression that this wasn't the first strange sighting he'd heard about, but without any evidence, there wasn't much he could do. We drove back to the spot in the daylight, hoping to find something, footprints, hair, anything that would confirm what we'd seen, but there was nothing. Just an ordinary stretch of Vermont road cutting through the forest. George and Carrie left that afternoon to head back to Boston. We didn't talk much about what had happened, but I know it affected them as deeply as it did me. Over the years, we've occasionally brought it up when we get together, trying to make sense of what we saw. George eventually convinced himself it was someone playing a prank, but Carrie and I aren't so sure. I've lived in Vermont all my life, spent countless hours in those woods, and I've never seen anything like that before or since. Sometimes I almost managed to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I remember the smell that seeped into the car, the steam rising from its body in the cold night air, those eyes reflecting our headlights. What bothers me most after all these years isn't what we saw. It's the creature's behavior. Why was it just standing there in the middle of the road? Was it waiting for something, for us? And where did it go so quickly, without leaving a trace? I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Green Mountains over the years. Some of them sound similar to what we experienced, but none exactly match. Whatever we saw that night doesn't fit neatly into any category I know of. I still drive that stretch of Route 4A sometimes. I always slow down at that bent tree, scanning the road and the forest beyond. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, just to prove to myself that I didn't imagine it. But a bigger part of me hopes I never do. Because the thing that stayed with me all these years is the distinct feeling I had when those eyes locked with mine through the windshield. It wasn't just looking at us, it was recognizing us, studying us, and maybe, just maybe, it's still out there in those woods, remembering our faces as clearly as I remember its silhouette against the moonlit Vermont night. Story 12. I've been a delivery truck driver for almost 20 years now, hauling everything from groceries to hardware across Oregon's back roads. You get used to seeing wildlife on these routes. Deer, coyotes, the occasional elk. But what I saw that morning in early October of 2009, that wasn't like anything I've ever encountered before or since. I remember it was a crisp fall morning, probably around 7:30. The sky was that pale blue you get in autumn, with just enough chill in the air to make you grateful for a warm truck cab and a thermos of coffee. My son Jake was riding with me that day. He was 12 at the time, and it was a teacher in service day at his school. He'd been begging to come along on one of my runs, and since it was just a short haul through central Oregon, I figured why not. We were passing through Powell Butte, this tiny little community that's basically just a post office and a few scattered houses. I'd driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times before. It runs along these wide open wheat and hay fields with the Cascade Mountains off in the distance. Beautiful country, but pretty empty. Jake was half asleep against the passenger door when we turned onto that country highway. I was keeping my eyes peeled for deer. They're always crossing the road around dawn, and I've had enough close calls to stay alert. The sun was just getting high enough to burn off some of the morning mist that hung over the fields. That's when I noticed something weird about 200, maybe 300 yards from the highway. There was this low rise where the ground slopes up towards some taller sagebrush, and I caught sight of this large black shape bent down in a green wheat field. At first glance, I thought maybe it was a farmer in dark clothes checking his crops, but something about the size and shape didn't seem right. I slowed the truck down a bit, squinting to get a better look. Jake must have noticed the change in speed because he sat up and asked what I was looking at. Before I could even answer, the thing straightened up. Holy shit. I've never felt my blood run cold like that before. This creature stood fully upright, and I swear it had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It wasn't just tall, but massive, thick through the shoulders and chest in a way that no human could ever be. The thing was covered in what looked like jet black hair, which stood out starkly against the pale morning light and the green of the wheat field. "Dad, what is that?" Jake whispered, pressing his face against the window. I couldn't even answer him. My mouth had gone completely dry. The most unsettling part was its head. It looked slightly pointed at the top, and it seemed to blend directly into these impossibly wide shoulders. There was barely any neck visible, just this continuous slope from head to shoulders. In its right hand, if you can call it a hand, it was holding what looked like a small branch, and it was picking at it with its left hand, like it was eating berries or buds or something off it. We were maybe doing 20 miles an hour at this point, just crawling along the highway. I wanted to floor it and get the hell out of there, but I couldn't look away. And then it saw us. This thing turned its attention directly to our truck. It didn't startle or run like a bear or other animal would. It just watched us, calmly. It turned its entire upper body to follow our movement as we passed. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance, but I could feel it staring at us. It was the most unnerving feeling I've ever experienced. "Dad?" Jake's voice was higher than normal. Is that what I think it is?" I remember mumbling something like, "I don't know, buddy." But in my gut, I knew exactly what we were looking at. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. As we passed the spot where I could see it clearly, I glanced in my side mirror and saw it was still standing there, still watching us. It hadn't moved, hadn't tried to hide. It was like it didn't care that we had seen it, like it knew we weren't a threat. I drove the next 10 miles in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. Jake kept looking back over his shoulder, even though we were long past where we could see anything. "Are we gonna tell Mom?" he finally asked. I remember taking a deep breath and trying to sound calmer than I felt. "Let's think about it first, okay? People might think we're crazy." Jake nodded, but I could tell he was processing what we'd seen. Hell, I was still processing it myself. The rest of that day's deliveries are a blur. I went through the motions, but my mind kept replaying those few moments over and over. The way it stood up, the impossible breadth of its shoulders, the deliberate way it turned to watch us pass. That night, after Jake had gone to bed, I sat at our kitchen table with a beer, staring out the window into our backyard. The trees at the edge of our property suddenly seemed more ominous. What else could be out there that we don't know about? My wife came in and asked if I was okay. I almost told her then, but something stopped me. How do you tell someone you saw something that shouldn't exist? Something that turns everything you thought you knew about the world upside down? A few days later, I was making another run through the same area, this time alone. It had snowed lightly the night before, unusual for early October, but not unheard of. As I was driving north of Powell Butte, something caught my eye on this steep ridge that runs parallel to the highway for a stretch. I pulled over at a wide spot in the road and got out of my truck. Using the binoculars I keep in my glove compartment for spotting wildlife, I focused on the ridge. There, clear as day in the fresh snow, was a line of tracks heading straight up the steep incline. These weren't deer tracks or elk tracks. They weren't even human tracks. At least, not from any human I've ever seen. They were huge, bigger than any boot print I've ever seen. And the spacing between them, Jesus, they were spaced so far apart, going in a perfectly straight line up this almost vertical ridge. No zigzagging like a person would need to do to manage that kind of climb. Whatever made those tracks had gone straight up that ridge like it was nothing. I remember standing there by the side of the road, the cold air burning my lungs, and feeling this overwhelming sense of being watched again. I scanned the tree line at the top of the ridge, half expecting to see that black shape standing there, observing me. But there was nothing. Just the snow, the trees, and those impossible tracks. I've been driving that same route 3 times a week for over 10 years now. I've never seen the creature again, but every single time I approach that curve in the highway near the wheat field where we first spotted it, I slow down. I scan that same rise where the ground slopes up toward the sagebrush. My heart rate picks up, and I get that same dry mouth I had that morning with Jake. Jake's in college now, studying wildlife biology. He doesn't talk about what we saw anymore, but sometimes I catch him looking out at the woods behind our house with this thoughtful expression. I wonder if he's still searching for answers too. I've read up on Sasquatch sightings since then. Some people report aggressive behavior, creatures throwing rocks or making threatening displays. But what strikes me about our encounter is how peaceful it was. It was just existing, eating its breakfast in a field at dawn. We were the intruders in its world, not the other way around. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized my truck. I've been driving the same route for years. Maybe it had seen me pass by many times before. Maybe that's why it wasn't startled when we saw each other. There was something almost familiar about the way it watched us. I've never reported what we saw officially. Who would believe me? A delivery driver and his kid claiming they saw Bigfoot eating berries by the side of the road. But I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I felt. That wasn't just some guy in a costume or a bear standing on its hind legs. The proportions were all wrong for either of those explanations. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. The thing that keeps me up at night sometimes isn't fear that it might have followed us or that it might be dangerous. It's the realization that if something that large, that significant, can exist without us knowing for sure, what else is out there? What other things might be living alongside us that we refuse to acknowledge or simply haven't noticed? Every morning when I get in my truck for work, I check my glove compartment to make sure my binoculars are there. Every time I drive through Powell Butte, I scan that rise. And sometimes, when the light is just right and the morning mist is hanging over those fields, I swear I can feel eyes on me again. I don't know if I want to see it again or not. Part of me does, just to confirm I didn't imagine the whole thing. But another part of me knows that seeing it once has already changed how I look at the world forever. Some things once seen can't be unseen. Jake asked me last Christmas if I ever think about that morning anymore. I told him the truth. I think about it every day. He nodded and said, "Me too, Dad, me too." I don't have any proof. No photos, no casts of those giant footprints in the snow. Just the memory of those few moments when something impossible stood up in a wheat field and watched my truck drive by. Just the knowledge that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we want to admit. And every time I drive that curve in the highway, I slow down, just in case. Story 13. Listen, I still get chills thinking about what happened that summer night. It was June of 2007, just after our softball league game. We'd played well that evening. I remember being in a great mood as we finished up around 9 o'clock. There were 7 of us hanging out after the game. Me, Lynn, Jean, Mike, Dave, Kelly, Sarah, and Jason. We were all in our 20s back then, just looking for something fun to do on a warm Iowa night. Jason brought up this abandoned resort near Knoxville that he'd heard about. Said it was this creepy old place that had been shut down for years. We were all riding that post-game high, feeling adventurous, so we thought, why not? I'd actually driven past it a few times, but never stopped to check it out. The place had this reputation around town, just one of those spots teenagers would dare each other to visit. We piled into Dave's van around 10 that night. I remember it was this beat-up Dodge with seats that smelled like fast food and old gym clothes, but it could fit all of us. The drive took maybe 25 minutes, with Jason giving directions from the back. The whole way there, we were joking around, talking about ghost stories and urban legends. None of us were taking it seriously. We were just looking for a bit of fun, you know? When we got there, Dave pulled over on the shoulder of the road, not wanting to drive through the gate that blocked the entrance. There was a no trespassing sign hanging on it, all rusted and bent. I remember hesitating for a second. Technically, we were about to trespass on private property, but everyone else was already climbing over, so I followed. It was one of those moments where you just go along with the group, not thinking about consequences. The moon was nearly full that night, which gave us enough light to see where we were going without flashlights. That detail has always stuck with me. How bright everything looked in that moonlight, creating these sharp shadows everywhere. The place was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned resort. Crumbling buildings with broken windows, a large empty swimming pool with cracks running through the concrete, and weeds growing through everything. Nature was slowly reclaiming it all. We spent about 20 minutes exploring the main buildings. Sarah kept saying she felt like we were being watched, but we all laughed it off. Looking back, I wish we'd listened to her. There were these small cabins scattered around the property, but most had partially collapsed roofs, so we didn't go inside. The whole place had this eerie silence to it, the kind that makes you talk in whispers without realizing why. After checking out the old lobby building, we decided we'd seen enough. It was getting late, probably around 11, and the novelty had worn off. Plus, Kelly was getting spooked by the whole thing and wanted to leave, so we started heading back toward the gate and the road where we'd parked. The path back took us between two wooded areas, not dense forest or anything, just clusters of trees and underbrush on either side of this gravel walkway. We were walking in a loose group, still laughing about some joke Jason had made, when I caught this smell. It hit me suddenly, like walking into a wall. God, that smell. I've tried describing it to people over the years, but words don't do it justice. It was like the worst body odor you can imagine, mixed with something animal, like wet fur and sweat and waste, all combined into this overwhelming stench. I remember my eyes actually watering. Jean and Mike noticed it at the same time I did. Mike suddenly stopped walking and was staring off into the woods to our right. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. About 25 feet off the path, partially hidden behind some brush, but clearly visible in the moonlight, was something. Something standing upright. Something tall and massive with wide shoulders, just watching us. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A shadow, a tree trunk. But no tree stands like that. This thing had a shape, a silhouette that was unmistakably, I don't know, person-like. But not a person, much bigger than any person I've ever seen. Gene, who's a big guy himself at 6'5", just turned and bolted. I'd never seen him move so fast. He sprinted back toward the gate and practically vaulted over it in 2 steps. That's what broke the spell for me and Mike. We both started running too, not even looking back. The others didn't see what we saw, but they caught our panic and followed us. I remember hearing Kelly yell, "What? What is it?" But none of us answered. We were just focused on getting the hell out of there. We all scrambled over that gate like our lives depended on it. Dave fumbled with his keys, dropping them once before finally getting the van door open. We piled in, breathing hard, and he peeled out so fast the tires kicked up gravel. Once we were on the main road, everyone started talking at once. What happened? What did you see? Why did we run? Gene was visibly shaken. His hands were trembling, and I'd never seen him like that before. This guy who played linebacker in college and wasn't afraid of anything. Mike kept looking out the back window of the van like he expected something to be following us. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but it sounded crazy even as I said it. There was something in the woods, something big, standing there watching us. Jason tried to rationalize it. Probably just a shadow or a fallen tree that looked like something in the moonlight. But I knew what I'd seen, and so did Gene and Mike. To prove it was nothing, or maybe to convince ourselves, Dave and I decided to go back. The others thought we were insane, but about 15 minutes later, we parked at the gate again. Dave brought a powerful flashlight this time. I was terrified, but also needed to know what we'd seen. We walked back to that spot between the wooded areas. The smell was gone completely, which was weird considering how overpowering it had been earlier. Dave shined his light exactly where I'd seen the figure standing, but there was nothing there. No fallen tree, no unusual shadow, nothing that could explain what we'd seen. We checked the ground for footprints but couldn't find anything definitive in the underbrush. Dave kept saying it must have been our imagination, but I could tell he was just trying to convince himself. We didn't stay long, maybe 5 minutes, before heading back to the van. When I think back to what I saw that night, I'm still certain it wasn't human. The height alone rules that out. I'm 6'3", and Gene is even taller at 6'5", but this thing had at least a foot on Gene. The shoulders were impossibly broad, and the body was thick, solid looking. The strangest part was how still it stood. It never moved, never made a sound, just watched us. I don't know how long it had been following us or watching our group explore the resort. The thought still makes my skin crawl. What really gets me is how silent it was. Whatever that thing was, it was huge, yet it made no noise on the gravel or in the leaves. How does something that big move without making a sound? And how did it disappear so completely in the short time between our running away and coming back with the flashlight? I've spent years trying to convince myself it was just a weird shadow or my imagination running wild. But then I remember Gene's face, how pale he went, how fast he ran. Gene wasn't the type to spook easily, and Mike saw it too. He quit coming to softball games after that night and eventually moved away from the area altogether. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I was the last person to ever think I'd be telling a Bigfoot story. I used to laugh at those shows on TV, thought it was all made up, but I can't explain what I saw any other way. The height, the build, the smell, it all fits with what other people have described. That abandoned resort is still there from what I've heard. It's become something of a local legend now, partly because of our story that spread around town. Kids dare each other to go there at night, but I've never gone back, not once in 16 years. Sometimes when I'm out hiking or camping, I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for that silhouette. I've developed this habit of sniffing the air, checking for that distinctive smell. It's like part of my brain is always on alert now. The weirdest thing is that I don't think it meant us harm. It could have easily caught up to us if it wanted to. We were just a bunch of out-of-shape softball players stumbling around in the dark, but it just stood there, watching, like it was curious about us, or maybe warning us that we were in its territory. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, half the time I try not to believe it myself, but on nights when I can't sleep and I'm replaying it all in my head, I know what I saw was real. That silent, massive figure standing in the trees, watching us with eyes I couldn't see but could somehow feel on me. That was real. And the worst part? I sometimes wonder if it's still out there, watching other people who venture into those woods, standing perfectly still until they notice that smell and look over to see something impossible staring back at them from the shadows. Story 14. I've never told anyone outside my family about what happened that day. Part of me still can't believe it, even though it's been over 65 years now. I was just a kid back then, 12 years old in the late summer of 1958. We had a modest farm in rural Kentucky, nothing fancy, just enough land for some crops and a handful of animals that kept us fed and gave us a little income. That evening started like any other. The air was heavy with humidity, that sticky kind that makes your shirt cling to your back. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across our property. Ma had called out that supper would be ready in about half an hour, which meant I had just enough time to finish my evening chores. I headed out to tend to our horses. We had 3 back then, Old Thunder, a weathered grey gelding that Pa had since before I was born, Maple, a chestnut mare with a white blaze, and Juniper, Maple's 2-year-old filly. They were good horses, calm and predictable. I knew their temperaments like I knew my own hands. The horse yard was about 70 yards from our farmhouse, with the forest edge another 50 yards beyond that. I remember walking out with the water bucket swinging at my side, whistling some tune that was popular on the radio. Nothing felt off at first. The crickets were starting up their evening chorus, and a few early fireflies had begun to blink in the tall grass near the fence line. I reached the water pump and started filling the bucket for the trough. That's when I noticed something was wrong with the horses. They were acting strange, not their usual selves at all. Old Thunder, who was normally so steady you could fire a shotgun next to him without getting more than a disinterested ear flick, was pacing nervously along the fence. His ears were pinned flat against his head, and his nostrils were flared wide. Maple had positioned herself between the forest and her filly, and Juniper was pressed against her mother's side, trembling. At first, I thought maybe a coyote or fox was nearby. We'd had trouble with predators before, though they rarely came so close to the buildings. I set down the half-filled bucket and walked toward the horses, thinking I might calm them down. "Easy now," I said, reaching for Thunder's halter. But he jerked away from me, something he'd never done before. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The horses weren't looking at me. They were staring fixedly at something behind me, toward the tree line. I turned around slowly, my heart already picking up speed. That's when I saw it. At first glance, I thought it was a man standing at the edge of the woods. It was getting dark, and all I could make out was a tall, broad silhouette, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. I remember thinking it might be Mr. Calloway, our nearest neighbor, though his property was a good mile away and he rarely came over unannounced. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain even to my own ears. No response, just that figure standing perfectly still. I squinted, trying to make out more details as my eyes adjusted to the fading light. And that's when I realized what I was seeing wasn't a man at all. For one thing, it was too tall. Much taller than Pa, who was 6 foot even, and considered a big man in our parts. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, and it was broad, not fat, but powerful looking, with shoulders twice as wide as a normal man's. But what really made my blood run cold was when I realized it was covered, head to toe, in dark, shaggy hair, not clothes, hair, or fur. In the dim light, it looked black or dark brown, though it's hard to be certain with the shadows playing tricks. I couldn't make out a face clearly, just a darker patch where a face should be. But I could feel it watching me. I don't know how else to explain it. There was a weight to its gaze, an intelligence behind it that felt different from watching an animal. It wasn't just looking in my direction, it was observing me, studying me. The bucket slipped from my fingers and clattered to the ground, water splashing over my shoes. I didn't even notice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was like my brain just shut down from the shock. All I could do was stand there, frozen, locked in some kind of staring contest with this creature. Behind me, thunder let out a panicked whinny, and Maple stomped the ground. The sounds seemed to come from a million miles away. All I could focus on was that thing standing at the edge of our property, watching me with that unnerving stillness. I don't know how long we stood like that. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time felt strange, stretched out like taffy. I remember absurd details popping into my head, wondering if Ma would be mad that I was late for supper, noticing how loud the crickets had suddenly become, feeling a bead of sweat roll down my spine. And then, without warning or apparent reason, it moved. Not toward me, thank God. It simply turned, unhurried, almost casual, and walked back into the forest. Its movements were smooth and deliberate, nothing like the jerky gait of a bear or the bound of a deer. It walked upright, just like a man, but with a strange rolling motion to its shoulders. It didn't crash through the underbrush or make any sound I could hear. It just melted back into the darkness between the trees. Once it disappeared from sight, it was like someone cut the strings holding me in place. My knees buckled, and I sat down hard on the ground. I was shaking all over, and my teeth were chattering even though the evening was warm. The horses were still agitated, but less frantic now that the thing was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it, if the fading light had transformed a bear or some other animal into that impossible figure. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I'd seen wasn't anything that was supposed to exist. Eventually, I heard Pa calling my name from the house. His voice snapped me back to reality. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning the water bucket where it lay, and ran for the house like the devil himself was chasing me. I burst through the kitchen door, out of breath and wild-eyed. Ma was setting the table, and Pa was washing up at the sink. They both turned to stare at me. "What in tarnation's gotten into you, boy?" Pa asked, drying his hands on a dish towel. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The words tumbled out of me, probably not making much sense. I told them about the horses being scared, about the thing standing at the tree line, how tall it was, how it was covered in hair and walked like a man, but wasn't a man. I expected Pa to laugh it off or tell me I'd been seeing things, but he didn't. His face got real serious, and he exchanged a look with Ma that I couldn't quite read. "You stay here with your mother," he said, taking his shotgun down from its place above the door. "I'm going to check on the horses and have a look around." Ma tried to talk him out of it, but Pa was stubborn that way. He loaded the shotgun at the table, then headed out into the gathering darkness. Those were the longest 30 minutes of my life, sitting at that kitchen table, barely touching my food, jumping at every little sound outside. When Pa finally came back, he looked troubled but calm. "Horses are settled now," he said, setting the shotgun back in its place. "No sign of anything unusual out there. Ground's too hard and dry for tracks." "But I saw it, Pa," I insisted. "I swear I did." He sat down heavily at the table. "I believe you saw something, son, just not sure what." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Best keep this between us, though. No need to go telling folks in town." "Why not?" I asked. "What if it comes back?" "People talk," was all he said, "and talk leads to trouble more often than not." I didn't understand then what he meant, but I respected Pa enough to do as he asked, so I kept quiet about what I'd seen, though for weeks afterward I was jumpy and nervous, especially at dusk. I refused to go near the horse yard alone in the evening, and Pa didn't force the issue, which told me more than words could have that he took what I'd seen seriously. Over time, I started to hear things, not directly, but snippets of conversation among the adults when they thought no kids were listening. Mr. Hanson, who owned the property 3 miles east of ours, mentioned finding strange tracks by his creek, too big to be a bear. Old Mrs. Whitaker, who lived alone in a cabin up in the hills, complained about something getting into her chicken coop, but not taking any chickens, just watching them, she said, like it was curious. No one ever came out and said what they thought was out there. It was always that thing, or you know what, or sometimes just meaningful looks and nods. But I knew they were talking about what I'd seen, or something like it. As the years went by, I convinced myself that maybe I had exaggerated the experience in my mind. Maybe it had been a bear standing oddly, or a particularly tall drifter passing through. The human mind has a way of transforming the mundane into the fantastic, especially when you're young and impressionable. But then there'd be moments, like when I was 16 and hunting in those same woods, and found a branch snapped clean off 15 feet up a tree, far higher than any man could reach. Or the time I was driving home late at night in my 20s and saw something large and dark cross the road ahead of me, moving with that same fluid, upright gait. Each time, that old feeling would come rushing back, that certainty that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I'm an old man now, my parents long gone, the farm sold decades ago when I moved away for work. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, or if it was the last of its kind, a relic from an older time that's now passed into memory. But what haunts me most is a thought that didn't occur to me until years later. What if it hadn't been the first time that thing had been watching me? What if it had been observing our farm, observing me for days or weeks before I finally noticed it? And after it walked away that evening, did it ever come back on nights when I wasn't looking? To this day, I sometimes wake up in the dark with the unshakable feeling of being watched. And in those moments, I'm 12 years old again, standing in our horse yard as the sun sets, meeting the gaze of something that shouldn't exist. Story 15. I still get goosebumps when I think about that night in November 1997. I've tried to rationalize what I saw for over 25 years now, but I can't explain it away no matter how hard I try. I was a junior at Southern Utah University back then, heading home to visit my parents for the weekend. It wasn't a trip I made often, about 3 hours each way, but my mom had been on my case about not visiting enough, and I had a light homework load that weekend. I left Cedar City around 5 in the evening. It wasn't the smartest move, considering November days are short, but I had a Friday evening shift at the campus bookstore that I couldn't get out of. I figured I'd still make it to my parents' place before 10, even with a quick dinner stop. The first part of the drive was fine. I remember listening to my Tori Amos cassette and feeling pretty relaxed. The sun had already set by the time I hit Panguitch, and that's when I realized I should have left earlier. Driving through Circleville Canyon at night wasn't ideal, but I'd done it before. The road winds through the mountains with these steep drop-offs and hardly any guardrails in some spots. During the day, it's actually pretty beautiful. At night, it's just creepy. It was around 7:30 or maybe 8 when I entered the canyon. The exact time is fuzzy now, but I remember checking my watch at some point and thinking I'd still make it home at a decent hour. There was absolutely no one else on the road, which wasn't super unusual for a Friday night in that area, especially that time of year. It's not exactly a major highway. My little Honda Civic handled the curves okay, but I was being cautious. The night was overcast. No stars, no moon, just pure darkness beyond my headlights. I had the radio on low, some local station that kept cutting in and out with static because of the mountains. The heater was blasting because it was freezing outside, probably in the 30s. I remember I was thinking about an essay I had due the following week when I first noticed something at the edge of my headlights. It was just a dark shape initially, off to the right side of the road. My first thought was deer, which is common in that area, so I immediately slowed down. The last thing I needed was to total my car, hitting a deer in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone. This was 1997, remember. I wouldn't get my first cell phone for another 3 years. As I eased off the gas and tapped the brake, the shape moved. That's when everything changed. The thing, I don't know what else to call it, stood up. It literally unfolded itself from a crouched position to standing. For a split second, my brain tried to make it a person. Maybe someone broke down, a hitchhiker, but nobody stands on the edge of a canyon road at night in the middle of nowhere, and nobody looks like that. As my car continued to slow, the figure suddenly darted across the road. It was maybe 70 feet ahead of me, close enough that my headlights caught it clearly, but far enough that I wasn't in danger of hitting it. Thank God for that, because I honestly don't know what would have happened if I had. The thing moved like nothing I've ever seen. It was tall, way taller than a person, 6.5, maybe 7 feet. It was covered in hair or fur that looked dark brown or black in my headlights. The arms were what really got me. They were unnaturally long, hanging almost to its knees. It ran hunched over, but even in that position it was huge. And the way it moved, it wasn't like a person jogging across the road. People have this bouncy motion when they run, right? This thing glided. It was incredibly fast, crossing the 2-lane highway in maybe 3 seconds. The movement was fluid, but powerful, like it could have gone 10 times faster if it wanted to. I'd slowed to maybe 20 miles per hour by this point, and I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't scream. I didn't even make a sound. It was like my brain short-circuited, and all I could do was stare. The creature never looked at me. It just crossed the road and disappeared into the darkness on the other side. There was a steep embankment there, leading down into the canyon, but it didn't seem to matter to this thing. It just vanished into the blackness like it belonged there. For a few seconds, I just sat there, foot on the brake, car idling in the middle of the empty road. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking. I remember thinking I should turn around and go back to Panguitch, but that would mean passing that spot again, and there was no way in hell I was doing that. Part of me wanted to stop completely and look for evidence. Footprints, broken branches, anything. But a much louder part of my brain was screaming, "Get out of here now!" I listened to that part. I stepped on the gas and kept going, constantly checking my rearview mirror, even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness behind me. For the rest of the drive through the canyon, maybe another 20 minutes, I was in a state of hyper-alertness I've never experienced before or since. Every shadow looked like it might be that thing. Every tree at the edge of my headlights seemed like it might start moving. I didn't dare turn the radio back on. I needed to hear if something was approaching my car. When I finally reached Circleville, this tiny town at the end of the canyon, I almost pulled over at the first house I saw. I wanted to tell someone, to have someone else validate what I'd experienced, but what would I say? Excuse me, I just saw a giant hairy monster in the canyon. They'd think I was crazy or drunk or both. So I kept driving. I stopped at a gas station about 30 minutes later in another town, and I remember the fluorescent lights feeling impossibly bright and normal. The cashier asked if I was okay, and I just nodded and bought a Coke. I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. By the time I reached my parents' house, I'd convinced myself that I needed to be rational about this. It was dark. I was tired. It was probably a bear standing on its hind legs. Except bears don't run like that, and they're not that tall, and they don't have arms that long. I didn't tell my parents that night. I went straight to my old bedroom and lay awake until dawn, replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind. I still remember every detail. The way its shoulders hunched, the strange smoothness of its movement, the absolute silence of the encounter. It never made a sound. Neither did I. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened. Almost. But I knew what I saw. I tried telling my dad in this casual way, like, "Hey, do people ever talk about seeing strange things in Circleville Canyon?" He just laughed and said something about mountain lions and my imagination. I never brought it up again. I took a different route back to college that Sunday, adding an extra hour to my drive just to avoid that canyon. For the rest of that semester, I made excuses about why I couldn't come home for weekends. When I did visit, I only drove during daylight hours and never alone. It's been years now, and I've told exactly 3 people about what happened. My college roommate thought I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and had a weird dream. My husband thinks I saw a guy in a costume, maybe some local playing a prank. A co-worker once mentioned Bigfoot sightings in Utah, and I got brave enough to share my story. She's the only one who ever seemed to take me seriously. I've looked online over the years, searching for similar stories from that area. There are a few vague reports of something large seen crossing roads in central Utah, hikers finding strange footprints, campers hearing unusual sounds at night. Nothing concrete enough to validate what I experienced, but enough to make me wonder. I've thought about going back there with a camera during daylight hours, just to see the spot again. But honestly, I'm scared. Not of seeing that thing again, though that terrifies me too, but of not finding anything, of standing there in broad daylight and having nothing to show for this experience that changed me. Because it did change me. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't take solo road trips through remote areas. I keep my doors locked even in our safe neighborhood. My husband thinks I'm being paranoid, but he didn't see what I saw. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what it was, but the feeling I had when I saw it. It was this overwhelming sense that I was seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that belongs to a world just slightly offset from ours. The rules I'd lived by my whole life about what's real and what isn't, all collapsed in those few seconds. Whatever I saw that night in Circleville Canyon wasn't supposed to be there, and yet it was. Moving with purpose across that lonely stretch of highway, completely indifferent to me and my little car and my human existence. It was just passing through from one shadow to another while I happened to be there with my headlights. Sometimes I wonder if it knows I saw it. If somewhere in those Utah mountains, it remembers the human who witnessed it that November night. I hope not, because while it showed no interest in me then, I can't shake the feeling that these things, whatever they are, prefer to remain unseen. Every now and then, when I'm driving at night and catch movement at the edge of my headlights, my whole body goes cold. For a split second, I'm back in that canyon, watching something impossible unfold itself from the darkness, and I hold my breath, waiting to see if it's going to cross my path again. Story 16. I've been holding this in for a long time. and I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I need to get this off my chest. What I saw back in September of 2004 still haunts me. It was a Friday night in early September. I remember because the weather had just started cooling down, and we could finally hang outside without sweating buckets. Me and 3 of my buddies, Jason, Mike, and Trent, were hanging at Jason's place in this small town just outside of Somerville. It's one of those places where everybody knows everybody and nothing exciting ever happens. At least, that's what I thought. We were in the middle of a movie marathon when Jason remembered he had some old camping gear stored in a shed at the back of his property that we needed for a trip planned the next weekend. It was around 10 at night, but we figured we'd grab it while we remembered. The 4 of us headed out into the yard with just a couple of flashlights between us. Jason's backyard is huge, and the shed sits way at the back, right up against this line of tall pine trees that mark where his property ends and the woods begin. I'd been to Jason's place dozens of times, but never paid much attention to how dense those woods were until that night. The moon was almost full, which gave us enough light to see our way. The shed was this old, decrepit thing, hadn't been painted in years, and the wood was warping. It looked like something from a horror movie, honestly. Jason jiggled the key in the rusty lock, and we all went inside. The inside of the shed smelled like old wood, motor oil, and something musty I couldn't place. We rummaged around for about 15 minutes, finding the sleeping bags and some other stuff we needed. The whole time, I kept feeling this weird sensation, like we were being watched. I chalked it up to the creepy atmosphere of being in a rickety old shed at night. Everyone grabbed what they needed, and they started heading back toward the house. The door to the shed had this weird latch that had to be pulled and pushed just right to close properly. I told the guys I'd catch up once I got the door secured. "Don't get murdered back there," Mike joked as they walked away. I struggled with the door for a couple of minutes. It was one of those frustrating things where you keep thinking you've got it, then it pops back open. Finally, I heard the satisfying click of the latch catching, and I turned to follow my friends, who were already halfway back to the house. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound from the direction of the trees, not like wind through leaves, but deliberate, like something big moving through the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks. The reasonable part of my brain said it was probably just a deer, or maybe even a coyote. We got those around here sometimes, but something made me turn and look. I'll never forget what I saw. Standing there just on the other side of the chain-link fence that separated Jason's property from the woods was a massive figure. The moonlight was just enough to see it clearly, and it was only about 15 feet away from me. My first thought was bear, but that thought vanished immediately. This thing was standing upright, and it was huge, not just tall, but massive in a way that's hard to describe. Its head sat low on these incredibly wide shoulders. There was no neck, or at least none that I could see. The shoulders just sort of sloped up to the head. I couldn't make out its face very well in the darkness, but I could see its chest, and that chest was moving, breathing, slow, deep breaths. In between those breaths was this low, rumbling growl that wasn't aggressive exactly, but more like warning me. I stood there frozen, too scared to run or even move. The thing shifted its weight, and I noticed its legs were set wide beneath this bulky torso, like tree trunks. When it moved, I could see the hair on its shoulders swaying slightly. It wasn't fur like a bear's. It was longer, more like human hair, but thicker. That's when it hit me what I was looking at. A Bigfoot, a freaking Sasquatch, right there in my friend's backyard in the middle of nowhere, Massachusetts. My mind was racing with conflicting thoughts. This can't be real, but also, I know exactly what I'm looking at. There was no mistaking it for anything else once I really saw it. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. I didn't dare break eye contact. I had this overwhelming feeling that if I turned my back on it, it would come over the fence after me. So I started backing away, slowly. One step, then another. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. With each step I took backward, I kept waiting for it to make a move, to climb over that fence, but it just stood there watching me. That chain-link fence suddenly seemed ridiculously inadequate. It couldn't have been more than 5 feet high. This thing could have stepped over it without much effort if it wanted to. As I backed away further, I noticed something else. It was not just warning me with that growl, it was communicating. It's hard to explain, but I got this clear impression that I was too close to its territory, and it was telling me to leave. Not in words, obviously, but the message was unmistakable. I kept backing up, one slow step at a time, until I was about halfway across the yard. That's when I heard Jason call from the back porch. "Dude, what's taking so long? The pizza's getting cold." I didn't answer. I didn't dare take my eyes off the creature. But when Jason called out, the Bigfoot shifted again. It seemed to look past me toward the house, then back at me. The growling got slightly louder. Finally, when I was about 20 feet from the porch, I risked turning around and walked quickly, not running, but moving as fast as I could without running to the house. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to sprint, but some instinct told me not to show fear by running. I practically fell through the back door and slammed it shut behind me. My friends looked at me like I was crazy. "Dude, what the hell?" Trent asked. I was breathing hard, and I'm sure I looked terrified, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd just seen. Who would believe me? I'd sound completely insane. "Thought I saw something," I managed to say. "Probably just a deer." "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mike said, laughing. "I'm fine," I insisted, grabbing a slice of pizza and trying to act normal. "Just spooked myself." We went back to watching movies, but I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about what was out there in those woods, probably still watching the house. Every time I heard a branch tap against a window from the wind, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept getting up to peek through the blinds, half expecting to see that massive figure standing in the yard, but there was nothing. The next morning, I made up an excuse to leave early. I couldn't bear the thought of going back out into that yard in daylight, of looking at those trees and remembering what I'd seen. I kept this to myself for almost a year. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friends. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled the crazy guy who thinks he saw Bigfoot. Then, almost exactly a year later, I was back at Jason's place. We were sitting on his back porch having a couple of beers, and out of nowhere he says, "You know, I found something weird back by the fence line last fall." My heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean?" "Right after that movie night when we got the camping gear. Next day, I was mowing and noticed a bunch of broken branches and flattened grass on the other side of the fence, like something big had been standing there. Thought maybe it was a bear, but we don't really get them around here much." I stared at him, my beer halfway to my mouth. "Did you see anything?" "Nah," he said, taking a swig from his bottle. "But sometimes I get this weird feeling when I'm out there by the shed, like something's watching me from those woods." That's when I finally told him. I spilled everything, the figure, the growling, the way it stood there watching me. To his credit, Jason didn't laugh or call me crazy. He just listened, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, my grandfather used to talk about something in those woods. The old-timers around here have stories. I always thought they were just trying to scare us kids, to keep us from wandering too far." Since that night, I've done a lot of research on Bigfoot sightings. Turns out there have been quite a few reports in our area over the years. Though most people keep quiet about it for fear of being ridiculed, I still don't know for sure what I saw that night. I just know it was real, it was massive, and it was intelligent enough to warn me rather than attack me. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods behind Jason's house, and if anyone else has seen it. All I know is that I never go near that shed after dark anymore. And whenever I'm at Jason's place and look toward those trees, I can't shake the feeling that something might be looking back. Story 17. I've never really told this story outside my family. It happened in winter of 2004 when I was 13. It's been almost 20 years, but I still get chills thinking about it. I've gone back and forth about what we actually saw that day, but I can't explain it away no matter how I try. We lived outside Hornbeck, Louisiana, in a house that backed up to hundreds of acres of pine forest. My little brother Danny was 9 at the time, and we had this old four-wheeler our dad had fixed up for us to ride around the property. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old Yamaha that had seen better days, but we loved that thing. That winter was unusually cold for Louisiana. We'd actually gotten a decent snow, maybe 3 or 4 inches, which was a big deal for us. School was cancelled and Dad was at work, so Mum said we could ride the four-wheeler as long as we stayed on our property and the trails we knew well. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we headed out. I remember because Mom had just made us lunch and we were bundled up in these puffy jackets that made it hard to move. Danny was sitting behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist. The cold air stung my face as we rode, but it felt good to be outside after being cooped up. We'd been riding for maybe 30 minutes, following this trail we knew like the back of our hands. It looped around behind our house, through a mix of pine and hardwood, down to a small creek at the bottom of a hill, and then back up. We'd ridden it 1,000,000 times in all seasons. That day, the snow made everything look different. It was really quiet too. Usually you'd hear birds or squirrels rustling around, but the snow seemed to absorb all the sound, just the rumble of the four-wheeler and the occasional sound of snow falling from tree branches. We were on the far side of the trail, probably half a mile from our house, where the path straightens out through this stand of young pine trees. They weren't very tall yet, maybe 15 feet high, and they were planted in pretty straight rows. The snow was untouched between them, no animal tracks or anything. I wasn't going very fast because the trail was slippery. We came around this bend, and the trail straightened out for about 100 yards before curving again. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, something dark moving between the trees about 100 feet ahead of us. But shadows don't move on their own, and there wasn't anything casting this shadow. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a bear. But we didn't really have bears in our area, at least not that we ever saw. As we got a little closer, I slowed down even more. Whatever it was big, really big, and it was walking upright on 2 legs. I remember feeling Danny's grip tighten around my waist. He'd seen it too. The thing was at least 7 feet tall, probably taller. It had these massive shoulders that looked like a football player wearing pads, except bigger. The shoulders were almost disproportionate to the rest of its body, but in a way that looked natural for it. Its arms hung down longer than a person's would. What really got me was the way it moved. It wasn't like watching a person walk. The stride was longer, and there was something about the way it swung its arms that just looked wrong. Not wrong like it was hurt, but wrong like it wasn't human. It moved with purpose, deliberate steps through the snow. It was covered in dark hair or fur, not black, but a really dark brown that stood out stark against the white snow. I couldn't see its face because it was moving away from us, kind of at an angle. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, Danny and I just sat there on the idling four-wheeler, watching this thing walk through the trees. It didn't seem to notice us at first. Then it stopped. It didn't turn around fully, but it kind of rotated its upper body like it had just sensed we were there. I didn't wait to see more. I don't know if it was looking at us or what, but every instinct in my body screamed to get out of there. I cranked the throttle and spun the four-wheeler around so fast that Danny almost fell off. He grabbed me tighter, and I felt him bury his face against my back. I've never driven that four-wheeler so recklessly. We tore back down the trail, slipping and sliding in the snow. I was terrified we'd crash, but I was more terrified of whatever that thing was coming after us. I kept thinking I could hear something behind us, but it was probably just my heart pounding in my ears. We hit the creek at the bottom of the hill. I didn't even slow down for the crossing. Water splashed up all around us, soaking our jeans, but I didn't care. We had to climb up this steep hill to get back to our yard, and with the snow, the four-wheeler struggled for traction. The tires spun, kicking up snow and mud. For a horrible moment, I thought we were going to slide backward down the hill back toward that thing. But somehow, we made it up. When we reached our backyard, I didn't even properly park the four-wheeler. I just drove it right up to the back door and left it running as Danny and I tumbled off and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. Mom was in the kitchen and looked up, startled, as we burst in, both of us breathing hard, soaking wet from the creek crossing and probably white as sheets. "What on earth happened to you two?" she asked. Danny started crying. I tried to explain what we'd seen, but it came out all jumbled. A giant man. Not a man. Something in the woods, walking weird, too big. Mom thought we'd crashed the four-wheeler at first and were making up a story to cover it up. When she realized the four-wheeler was still running outside, she went to turn it off. I begged her not to go outside, but she just gave me this look like I was being ridiculous. After we calmed down and changed into dry clothes, I tried to explain better what we'd seen. Mom listened, but I could tell she didn't really believe us. She suggested it was probably just a hunter in dark clothing, and the snow and trees played tricks on our eyes about how big he was. But I knew better. No hunter moves like that, and no human is that big. Dad got home around 6 that evening, and Mom told him about our adventure. He listened more seriously than Mom had. Dad had grown up hunting in those woods and knew them well. He didn't dismiss us outright. Could have been a black bear, he suggested. They do stand up sometimes. But I'd seen pictures of bears. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for long distances, and the proportions were all wrong. 3 days later, the snow had started to melt, and Dad offered to go with me to look at the spot where we'd seen the creature. Danny refused to come along. He hadn't gone near the four-wheeler since that day and had been having nightmares. Dad and I walked the trail, and I showed him exactly where we'd been and where the thing was walking. We looked for tracks, but the snow had melted enough that everything was just a slushy mess. There were impressions in the ground, but nothing clear enough to say what had made them. The place where we'd seen it was right at the edge of our usual riding area. Beyond that, the woods got thicker and dropped down into these low pine bottoms and old creek beds. We didn't go there much. It was hard to navigate, easy to get turned around in, and there were lots of places where the four-wheeler couldn't go. Dad didn't say much as we walked back home. He didn't tell me I was making it up, but he didn't confirm my suspicions either. All he said was, "Woods can play tricks on your eyes sometimes, Tyler, but always trust your gut. If something feels wrong, you get out of there, just like you did." I didn't ride that trail for months afterward. Danny wouldn't go near it for even longer. When we finally did start using the four-wheeler again, we stayed in the open fields closer to the house. I've thought about that day a lot over the years. I've watched those TV shows about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and what we saw matches a lot of the descriptions. The height, the broad shoulders, the distinctive walk, the dark hair. The contrast against the snow made it impossible to mistake it for a shadow or trick of the light. It was solid. It was real. Some people might think we were just kids with active imaginations who spooked ourselves, but I know what I saw. I can still picture it perfectly. That massive silhouette moving through the pines, the unnatural gait, the way it sensed us without fully turning around. The woods behind our house suddenly felt different after that. Like they held secrets I wasn't supposed to know about. I became hyper-aware of sounds when I was outside, breaking branches, rustling leaves. I'd catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement. We moved away from that house a couple years later when Dad got a new job. I've only been back to visit a few times, and I've never gone back into those woods. Danny and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes when we're together, and the conversation lags, I can tell we're both thinking about it. I still don't know what it was for certain, but I'm convinced we saw a Sasquatch that winter day in the Louisiana woods. Nothing else makes sense. Nothing else explains what we saw. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, walking those same trails, waiting for someone else to come around that bend.